Everyone thinks they know how a knight fought: blade, flashing armor shining, enemies politely attacking one at a time. But the real battlefield was nothing like the stories. It was louder, messier, and far more terrifying. And the weapons knights carried weren't used anything like you've seen on screen. If you want to know how it actually felt to fight inside a storm of steel, stay with me. The truth is far stranger and far more human than the movies ever show. Before we step into the mud, steel, and noise of medieval battlefields, take a moment to settle in, breathe slowly, and let the world outside fade away. Tonight's story isn't the polished tale you see in movies, it's the quieter, heavier truth of how knights actually fought, how their weapons worked, and what really happened beneath all that armor. It's a story of broken lances, crushed shields, and desperate moments that never make it into the heroic paintings. If you enjoy drifting off to these calm, oddly comforting journeys through the past, consider subscribing to this channel, just a small gesture that helps keep these long, sleepy histories coming to you night after night. Now, let's begin. The battlefield is waiting, and the knights are riding toward a reality far harsher than legend. Most people imagine a knight stepping onto a battlefield with the kind of confident swagger you see in movies, sun glinting off polished armor, horse rearing dramatically, banners snapping in the wind as if the universe itself paused to admire the scene. But the truth begins in a far more unsettling place, somewhere quiet and cold, where a knight stands behind the lines in the minutes before the first charge, heart pounding inside his chest like a fist pounding on a door, breath fogging inside a helmet that suddenly feels too small, and the weight of every past decision settles on his shoulders heavier than the steel he wears. That moment, the moment before the scream of battle breaks the world open, is where his training is truly tested. The sword at his side, the one his family paid a small fortune for, the one poets write about, is not what he reaches for. Instead, he adjusts the grip of his shield or shifts his lance into place, because he knows that the stories told about knights are neat and glorious. But the actual craft of staying alive in hand-to-hand combat is an entirely different skill, one learned through bruises, fear, and repetition so relentless it blurs into muscle memory rather than conscious thought. And before any weapon becomes useful, before any clash of steel can happen at all, a knight must first withstand the thing no romantic tale ever cares to describe: the crushing, suffocating uncertainty of not knowing whether he will still be breathing by nightfall. In reality, the first shock of battle wasn't the sound of swords. It was the sound of hundreds of men shifting in armor, horses stamping nervously, leather straps tightening, shields knocking together, an orchestra of small, anxious noises carried across a field that still belonged to the quiet morning. The knight could smell the damp earth beneath him, the bitter scent of old fires clinging to the air, the sweat inside his padded gambeson, already sticky even before the fighting began. Nothing about this moment felt noble or inspiring. It felt like standing at the edge of something ancient and unforgiving, something the stories never warned him about. He would glance at the men beside him, some hardened veterans with the blank expressions of those who have seen too much, others, young and terrified eyes darting from left to right, as if searching for a path that simply didn't exist. Even the horses sensed what was coming. War horses were trained to be fearless, but fear has a smell, and they felt it running through the ranks like a breath of winter. They shifted, whinnied, shook their heads, as if asking their riders one final time whether this truly had to be done. A knight was expected to pretend he didn't feel fear, but the truth is that every heartbeat reminded him that fear was the oldest companion of war and the only honest one. And then there was the waiting. The part movies skip because it looks boring on camera, but in reality was the most dreadful part of all. A knight waited for the order to move. He waited for the horn blast or the shouted command, waited for his commander to raise a hand, waited for the signal that would push him from the relative safety of stillness into the unpredictable violence of movement. In this waiting, time stretched strangely. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes like hours. Every thought, every memory, every regret, every hope rushed through him in a wave too large to control. He thought of his family, his land, his childhood, the lessons drilled into him since he was old enough to lift a wooden practice sword. He thought of mistakes he'd made in training that suddenly felt dangerously prophetic. He thought of the men he might face, men who were also waiting, also afraid, also hoping to survive. And above all, he thought of the truth he had learned the first time he ever trained with real steel. That battle was not a place where graceful choreography happened. It was a place where things collided, broke, bled, slipped, cracked, screamed, and where plans dissolved faster than snow in fire. The first command to advance always felt unreal, like stepping into a nightmare he had just convinced himself wouldn't actually happen. He lowered his visor, hearing the metallic click that sealed him into dim claustrophobic darkness, and suddenly the world outside became a muffled echo, a distorted tunnel of sight and sound. The visor slit limited his vision to a narrow slice of the battlefield, and through it he saw shapes moving, glimmers of steel, shifting banners, the trembling shimmer of distant soldiers forming ranks of their own. The knight gripped his reins tighter. The horse beneath him tensed, its muscles coiling like a bowstring, and as he moved forward with the rest of the formation, the most important rule of real combat became brutally clear. Survival depended less on personal glory and more on discipline, coordination, and the ability to stay close to the men beside him. Movies loved to show knights charging into battle completely alone, but that was a fantasy. A single knight isolated from his companions was not heroic. He was doomed. Real battle demanded unity, demanded trust, demanded that each man's shield become part of a temporary human wall. Without that wall, the first rush of the enemy would break him before his sword ever left its sheath. As the formation advanced, the ground trembled under pounding hooves, and every step sent a jolt through the knight's armor, rattling against bones and nerves. He could hear the clatter of metal all around him, the rhythmic thumping of his horse's heartbeat beneath him, the ragged breaths of the men riding on either side. He felt the air shift when the first volley of arrows shot overhead, not the colorful slow-motion arcs Hollywood loves, but a terrifying hiss like a swarm of angry insects slicing through the sky. Some arrows thudded into shields, others vanished into the ground or bodies. He didn't dare look to see who had fallen. Looking meant losing focus. Losing focus meant dying. And so he kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched, body braced, waiting for the moment when the distance between the two armies collapsed into something violent and unavoidable. And then impact. Not the neat, cinematic clash where swords spark theatrically, but the messy, bone-jarring collision of bodies, horses, shields, and spears, all slamming together in a chaos so sudden it felt like falling into a pit. The knight felt his lance drive forward with all the force his horse could muster. He didn't aim for dramatic accuracy. He aimed for the center mass of whoever stood in front of him. The shock of hitting an armored opponent sent vibrations up his arm so strong it felt like his elbow had split apart. His lance shattered good. It was meant to, but the splintering wood flew back toward him, stabbing through the air like a burst of angry needles. Someone screamed. He wasn't sure if it was him, his horse, or the man he'd struck. The impact shoved him sideways, and he barely kept his seat. He dropped the useless shaft of the lance without hesitation. A knight never tried to save a weapon in that moment. Clinging to it meant dying with it. What followed after the initial impact wasn't a clean duel. It was a suffocating press of bodies fighting at distances too close, too fast, too unpredictable for elegance. The knight saw almost nothing, just flashes of metal, blurred shapes, boots, shields, the frantic swing of an enemy's arm, the stump of a broken spear, the corner of a banner whipping wildly. He felt a blow slam into his shield with enough force to numb his entire arm. He felt hands grab at his reins, trying to pull him down. He felt his horse rear, panicked, striking out with its hooves. Every movement was instinctive, born from training drilled into him until it became the only thing between life and death. This was not a place for clever quips, for heroic speeches, for dramatic leaps. This was a place where the knight had to rely on every rusty scrap of instinct he possessed, because thinking too much meant hesitation, and hesitation meant ending up trampled into the mud. He tried to draw his sword once, only to realize he couldn't. There was no room to swing it. Bodies pressed so close that even lifting his arm felt impossible. Someone screamed near his ear. Someone fell against his leg. Someone else slammed a shield into his side and nearly toppled him from the saddle. And in that blur of panic, the knight understood something every warrior eventually learned. The battlefield was never under anyone's control, not even the bravest knight. It was a living, heaving creature made of confusion and terror, and a man survived not by mastering it, but by flowing with it, pushing when it opened, bracing when it closed, moving when it allowed, striking only when the tiniest gap appeared, like a whispered invitation. Didn't he notice the moment when fear ceased to be fear and became something else entirely, something sharp, burning, electric? It happened when he narrowly blocked a blow that could have killed him. It happened when his horse saved his life by lunging forward unexpectedly. It happened when he realized he had no time to think about survival anymore, because surviving had become the only thing his body understood. In those moments, battle no longer felt like a story or a test. It felt like the world had shrunk to a single point. One man, one heartbeat, one desperate effort to keep moving in a place where everything else sought to stop him forever. When the fight finally began to thin and the formations loosened, the knight looked around through the narrow slit of his visor and realized how little he recognized. The field was different. The people around him were different. The sounds had changed from the frantic roar of clashing forces to the scattered grunts and cries of smaller, isolated struggles. His arms ached, his chest heaved, his mouth tasted of metal, and still he held his shield forward because he knew the danger wasn't gone. There was no triumphant music, no dramatic final pose, just exhaustion and the cold knowledge that he'd survived the first few minutes, nothing more. And that was the true first shock of real medieval combat. Nothing looked like the legends, nothing felt like the paintings, and nothing about it resembled the elegant choreography that modern stories love to romanticize. The knight understood now, in his bones, that the battlefield was not a stage but a storm, and every man in it was trying not to drown. That revelation, the harsh, unfiltered truth of what battle really demanded, was the beginning of a knight's education, not the end. And it was only after he lived through this brutal awakening that he could begin to understand how his weapons were meant to be used. Not in dreams or stories, but in the raw, unpredictable chaos of real survival. Most people grow up thinking of the medieval sword as the ultimate symbol of knightly power, the shining blade, the flawless weapon, the hero's companion that slices through armor, enemies, and occasionally even stone when the movie needs dramatic emphasis. But the knight who survived a real battlefield learned very early that the sword was not the star of war. It was the understudy, waiting in the wings, only stepping onto the stage when everything else had gone wrong. The stories, of course, decorate swords with names, magical properties, and legacies as old as kingdoms. But the knights who actually carried them knew a colder truth. A sword was a tool for emergencies, not glory. In the quiet moments between battles, a sword might be polished until the steel gleamed like a strip of moonlight, admired for its craftsmanship, its balance, its lineage. But in the heart of the frayware, mud swallowed boots, and men crashed together so tightly that you could taste another soldier's breath inside your helmet. The sword was nearly useless for most of the fight. It couldn't cut through plate armor, couldn't break a shield wall, couldn't stop a charging horse, and couldn't match the reach of a spear or parum. And yet, despite all of this, when the moment came to draw it, a knight felt a strange sense of dread wrapped inside a strange sense of calm, because drawing the sword meant everything else had failed, and he was now relying on the one weapon designed for chaos at arm's length. A sword was never the first choice. That honor belonged to the lance or the spear, weapons that could strike before an enemy was close enough to smell. A knight would shatter a lance in the charge, lose his spear in the crush, then hack with a mace or hammer while still mounted if he could manage it. Only when the horse was halted, the shield battered, or the formation broken would the knight reach instinctively for his sword. That gesture, so simple in imagination, was surprisingly difficult in practice. Imagine trying to pull a blade from your belt while armored men crash into you from all sides, while your shield is pinned by the weight of bodies, while the earth beneath you churns into a slick, treacherous pit of mud, blood, and trampled grass. The movies show the sword drawn in a swift, easy, clean motion. Reality made that motion a gamble. The knight had to wrench the blade free while keeping his balance, keeping his shield up, and keeping his horse steady if he was still mounted. Even drawing the sword felt like defiance, an assertion of will in a place where will was the thinnest thread holding a man together. And then there was the problem of intent versus result. In the movies, a knight swings his sword and enemies fall dramatically in neatly choreographed arcs. Real swords did not carve through armor. They bounced, skidded, struck sparks, or glanced off metal plates with dull, ringing thuds that vibrated all the way into the knight's shoulders. Against mail, the edge could bite, but not deeply not, unless the knight found an angle, a weak spot, a moment of unguarded flesh. Against plate, The edge was almost decorative. A knight quickly learned to use the sword like a hammer, relying on weight rather than sharpness, focusing on thrusts and half-swording techniques, where the blade was gripped halfway up like a lever, turning the sword into a narrow stabbing tool, meant to find gaps at the neck, armpit, visor, or groin. None of these actions looked graceful. None would earn applause. They were awkward, frantic, messy movements made in a space so cramped and claustrophobic that a single misstep could wedge your arm between two bodies and trap it there, leaving you defenseless. A battlefield wasn't generous with space. It didn't allow for wide, sweeping cuts. The sword's reach was limited, and the knight often found that even lifting the weapon for a strike meant smashing his elbow into someone behind him or catching his blade on a shield in front of him. Every swing risked losing balance. Every thrust risked lodging the blade in something and failing to pull it free in time. But the sword's greatest strength wasn't its cutting ability, it was its reliability. It didn't break like a lance. It didn't stick like a spear. It didn't require the momentum of a mace. It worked when visibility was low, when the enemy was close, when the world had collapsed into a tight knot of bodies, where breath felt stolen and movement felt impossible. In those terrible seconds, when the knight felt the ground tilt beneath him, when his shield arm trembled under repeated blows, when he felt hands grabbing, pulling, clawing at his limbs, or reins the sword became the one thing he could trust to remain in his grip. But even trust had limits. A sword could crack, it could bend, it could slide from blood-slicked gloves. And the knight knew this as well as he knew his own heartbeat. So he used it not as a hero in a story would, but as a survivor would, cautious, deliberate, economical. He aimed not for cinematic kills, but for targets of opportunity. A hand gripping a weapon, a knee exposed by a shifted stance, the side of a neck when the opponent turned too quickly, the gap at the elbow where plates did not quite touch. These strikes were quick, instinctive, silent. No snarling heroics, no witty declarations. Just the sharp, focused effort to stay upright and breathing for one more heartbeat. And sometimes, more often than we like to imagine, the sword was used not to kill but to create space. A knight might slam the flat of the blade into a shield to push an enemy away, use the crossguard like a hook to drag aside a weapon, or shove the pommel into an opponent's face through the narrow vision of his visor. These moves weren't elegant, they were desperate. The sword was the ultimate multi-tool of war, and knights used it in every ugly, practical way they could think of. If the knight fought on foot, the sword often felt like a lifeline. Without the horse's strength beneath him, he had to rely on his own footing, and footing on a medieval battlefield was treacherous beyond description. Mud grabbed ankles like hungry hands. Blood made the ground slick. Loose stones rolled under boots. Fallen bodies, friend and foe, alike formed uneven mounds that turned every step into a gamble. In these conditions, balance determined survival. Many a knight fell not from a sword strike, but from a stumble, and a stumble in the wrong place could mean a swift end beneath the weight of trampling boots, or the point of a dagger forced into a vulnerable seam of armor. The sword, in such moments, became a counterweight, a thing to lean on, a thing to brace with, a thing to push against the tide, with as the knight forced himself to keep moving, keep breathing, keep fighting the pull of panic rising in his throat. And yet through all the horror, all the struggle, there was something strangely intimate about sword combat that movies rarely capture. At close range, the knight could hear the rasping breaths of the man trying to kill him. He could hear the grunt of effort behind every swing, the curse muttered under breath, the clatter of teeth knocked against the inside of a helmet. He could see the fear in the eyes behind a visor slit, or the sweat dripping from a forehead exposed by a raised helm. He could smell the other man's sweat, his panic, the metallic temps of blood in the air. In that tight, suffocating space, the sword wasn't just a weapon. It was the only barrier between two men engaged in the oldest, rawest struggle humans have ever known, the fight to live at another's expense. But despite all of this, despite the necessity and the intimacy of the sword, knights still treated it as secondary. They admired it in peace, respected it in war, but they didn't rely on it the way stories suggest. A sword wouldn't save a knight from a cavalry charge. It wouldn't stop a hail of arrows. It wouldn't break a shield wall. It wouldn't give him reach against a spear. It wouldn't protect him when he fell. And yet, when all else fell apart, when the formation collapsed, when the horse went down, when the shield cracked, When the mace slipped from numb fingers, the knight reached for his sword, because it was the one thing that could still function in the middle of absolute chaos. Drawing the sword was not a heroic moment, it was a confession, a silent admission that the knight was now in the part of battle where survival depended on instinct and luck as much as skill. In that moment, he became not a shining figure from legend, but a frightened, determined human being, fighting within a tiny bubble of space carved out by his own stubborn refusal to die. And perhaps that is why the sword became such a symbol in stories, not because it was the best weapon, but because it was the last one, the final boundary between life and death. The reminder that even armored warriors, mounted on powerful horses and trained for years, eventually faced moments where everything came down to a single blade held in a shaking hand. The movies will always show the sword as the beginning of battle, but real knights knew the truth. The sword was the moment when the battle became personal, when war shed its grand illusions and revealed the small, desperate fight for survival that each knight carried out alone inside the chaos. It's strange how the sword, that narrow strip of steel no longer than a man's arm, somehow became the eternal symbol of knighthood, even though it was never the tool a knight relied on first when the world narrowed into the chaos of battle. Legends, songs, and centuries of romantic paintings have carved the sword into a kind of holy relic. But if you were standing beside a real knight in the moments before impact, before the horses thundered, before the air filled with splintering wood, you would notice something quietly contradictory. The sword was usually still sheathed. It wasn't the weapon he lowered when the lines began to close. It wasn't the weapon he trusted when his fate depended on the weight of his first strike. Swords were expensive. Yes, beautifully made, balanced like nothing else of the age. But they were sidearms fallback tools, more like a medieval insurance policy than the heroic centerpiece of combat. And if you look closer at the old accounts, at the manuscripts written by men who actually survived the crush of bodies and armor, you start to see the truth. Swords were the weapon a knight turned to after other things had already gone wrong, or after the battlefield had changed into something far uglier than the movies ever dared to show. A knight strapping into his armor before a battle would likely be thinking more about his lance, his mace, his axe, or even the long, brutal poleaxes carried by his foot soldiers. The sword was a last resort for when things collapsed into tight, desperate spaces, when the cavalry charge shattered and men were suddenly fighting face to face, shoulder, with no room to swing anything longer than an arm's length. For all its symbolism, a sword isn't very good at dealing with armor, and once plate armor became widespread, the sword's glory dimmed even further. A blade simply glances off steel plate unless you know precisely where to strike into gaps, into the soft folds beneath the arms, into the visor's thin slit, into the groin where only mail protects. The sword's cutting edge wasn't what a knight depended on. Instead, he might use the blade like a lever, a hook, a wedge. Sometimes he would half-sword, gripping the blade itself with his gauntleted hand, turning the weapon into a short spear, guiding the point with absolute control into the smallest weaknesses of an opponent's armor. It was careful, cold, surgical work, not the wide, wild arcs movies loved to show. On a real battlefield, big swings would get your weapon trapped, your balance broken, or simply fail to do any damage at all. Knights knew this. They trained for it. They lived through it. But swords still mattered deeply, not for the reasons you'd think. A knight's sword was personal, a symbol of identity, of rank, of heritage. It was one of the few objects a man might name, dress with jewels, or leave in his will as if it carried a soul of its own. The sword told the world who you were. It told stories for you, but the sword was not the weapon that opened the battle. It was often the weapon that finished it, and finishing a medieval fight was rarely cinematic. Imagine a knight knocked from his horse, knee-deep in mud, shield splintered, lance broken, and men advancing from every direction. In a moment like that, the sword became not a romantic symbol, but a lifeline, a short, manageable tool for survival. Yes, knights could thrust with precision, but they also used their swords to punch, jab, hook, and even strike with the pommel like a hammer. Many medieval manuscripts show knights gripping the sword by the blade, using the crossguard like a two-pronged punching weapon to push a metal point into an enemy's visor. Blood and breath and fear would fill the narrow space between two helmets. This was not graceful. This was not elegant. This was close-quarter survival in heavy armor, with the sound of your own heartbeat echoing against the inside of your helm. Something else rarely mentioned in movies is how much technique went into simply holding a sword. A knight didn't squeeze it like modern actors do. His grip was relaxed, flexible, sensitive to vibration. Steel ringing against steel could tear the weapon right from his stiff hand. And so medieval fighters learned to let the shock pass through them instead of fighting it. They learned angles, not power. They learned openings, not brute force. Most swordsmanship was about controlling the opponent's movement, redirecting, manipulating, stepping into a better position. In manuscripts like the German Fechtbook traditions, you see masters teaching not flashy spins, but subtle footwork. Cuts delivered from the shoulder, quick thrusts from the hip, body mechanics built to exhaust an enemy's stamina before your own failed. And always, the knight is calm, measured, patient. A real fight wasn't won by swinging harder. It was won by waiting for that single moment when your opponent's weight shifted too far forward, or his guard dropped a hair too low, or his visor opened just a fraction too long. That's when the sword struck not dramatically, but decisively. But the battlefield itself made everything more complicated. Imagine the noise, thousands of armored men pressing together, the metallic breathing of horses, the crash of polearms, the panic of being struck by something you didn't see. That kind of chaos kills finesse. Sword fighting in battle rarely looked like the elegant duels taught in training halls. Combat devolved quickly into short bursts of violence. Moments of terrifying clarity suddenly swallowed by confusion. A knight might fight 3 men at once, then break away, then sprint toward a familiar banner, then fall, then rise again, sword in hand, swinging not with choreographed technique, but with the raw instinct to survive. And yet through all of that technique didn't vanish. It simply condensed. Instead of full techniques, knights used fragments, a half-remembered disarm, a single cut drilled into muscle memory, a thrust delivered almost without thinking. Real sword use in battle was like lightning short, sharp, impossible to predict. A surprising truth is that a sword was often more useful before and after a battle than during it. On the march, a knight might use his sword to cut rope, prepare camp, or signal troops. After the battle, when the killing ended, the sword became a ceremonial object again. A knight might raise it in salute, drive it into the earth in prayer, or place it across the body of a fallen comrade. There's a strange duality to the medieval sword, a tool of intimacy and devastation, but also a symbol of honor, loyalty, and grief. It was the first thing a knight reached for when he dressed, and the last thing removed before he slept. Even when not used in battle, the sword's presence mattered. It reminded everyone, including the knight, that he belonged to a warrior class whose duties were both violent and sacred. Another reason the sword became legendary is simple practicality. Swords survive, wooden weapons rot, lances shatter, axes corrode, but swords, especially high-quality ones, endure for centuries. Archaeologists uncover them in riverbeds, in graves, in abandoned fortresses, and we romanticize what survives. But the medieval battlefield didn't bend itself around our later fantasies. Most knights died with broken weapons, lost shields, dented helmets, and armor scorched by the sun. But their swords, if recovered, outlasted memory itself. They became relics, artifacts, museum pieces, storytellers of the ages. The world forgets the shattered lance that actually mattered in the charge. It forgets the mace that broke a helmet, the dagger that finished the fight, the poleaxe that turned the tide. But it remembers the sword, because the sword survived. There's also the matter of cost. A sword worthy of a knight wasn't cheap. It demanded skilled labor, imported steel, hours of forging, quenching, and polishing. A good swordsmith wasn't just a craftsman, he was part scientist, part artist, part mystic. Some blades were said to contain fragments of meteorite iron. Others were hammered so precisely that the steel held patterns like water flowing across the surface. Knights believed in these things. They believed a sword's quality reflected their own worth. Some carried blades passed down for generations, older than the kingdoms they fought for. Others commissioned swords with inscriptions, charms, or religious symbols etched along the fulla. A sword wasn't simply made, it was birthed, and because of that, it naturally became mythic, even if its actual role in battle was quieter, more limited, more circumstantial than later storytellers wanted to admit. But perhaps the strangest thing, the part most distant from the modern imagination, is how often swords broke. Yes, broke. A sword might chip, crack, bend, or snap entirely in the heat of battle. Hitting armor, shields, helmets, or even bone could ruin a blade beyond repair. Knights knew this and didn't trust the sword as their primary weapon. You don't charge into battle with something that might fail on the first bad strike. That's why the lance, the axe, the mace, and the poleaxe were preferred. They were brutal, simple, reliable. A sword was precision. These were force, and in war force usually won. So when you picture a battlefield full of clashing swords, erase that image. Replace it with the sound of wood snapping, metal crunching, heavy weapons slamming into shields. Swords were part of the battle, yes, but never the star. Still, when the moment came when the knight's primary weapon was gone, or when the fighting closed into a suffocating knot of bodies, the sword stepped into its true purpose. It became the extension of a knight's last line of defense, or his first chance at escape. The working edge might be chipped, the blade dented, the hilt slick with sweat or blood, but the sword remained a strange, loyal companion. In tight quarters, a knight could trust it. Not for slashing, not for dramatic swings, but for small, deadly movements that took advantage of inches rather than feet. A thrust into an armpit, a push into a neck opening, a hammering blow with the pommel against a visor hinge. It was the weapon of last opportunities, and sometimes those opportunities meant the difference between being ransomed, being rescued, or dying in the mud beneath someone else's boots. If you've ever wondered how a knight actually felt when gripping his sword in combat, imagine this: the world around you shrinking to a narrow tunnel of steel and noise. Your breath harsh inside your helmet, your limbs heavy, your heart hammering, your body bruised from falling, tripping, being struck. All you have left is the weight of the sword in your hand, or weight you know intimately, a balance you've practiced with for years. You lift it, not high like in the movies, but close to your body, guarded, controlled. You wait for a gap, for a falter, for something, anything that gives you the chance to strike. And when that moment comes, you don't shout or leap dramatically. You thrust, you push, you seize that instant of advantage and drive the point home with a kind of quiet desperation that no painting ever captures. By the time the battle ends, most swords are no longer the pristine, gleaming weapons you see in film posters. They're scratched, scarred, dulled, dirty. A knight might spend hours after the fight repairing his blade, polishing it, checking the edges, rewrapping the grip. That labor wasn't just maintenance, it was a small ritual of gratitude, a silent moment where a warrior acknowledged the strange partnership between man and metal. And when the sword was restored, when it hung once more at the knight's hip, it returned to being what it had always been: a symbol, a promise, a story waiting for the next telling. If there is one truth to carry from all of this, it is simple. Knights didn't carry swords because they were the best weapon. They carried swords because they were the most meaningful. And meaning, in the medieval world, was often more powerful than function. The sword told the world who a knight was, even if it was not the weapon that won his battles. If you truly want to understand how knights used their weapons, you can't start with the weapons. You have to start with the armor, because armor quietly dictated every movement, every decision, every hope and fear a knight carried into battle. Forget the stiff, clunky metal suits Hollywood shows. Real medieval armor was an engineering masterpiece, layers of iron and steel shaped so precisely to the body that a well-trained knight could run, jump, roll, vault onto a horse and fight for hours without losing mobility. It wasn't lightweight by any means, but it distributed weight so cleverly that a knight often felt more protected than burdened. And this protection changed the entire rhythm of combat. Instead of fighting to avoid every blow, knights fought knowing the first few hits, sometimes the first dozen, wouldn't kill them. Armor made the battlefield less about the fear of a single strike and more about endurance, positioning, and exploiting microscopic weaknesses. It turned combat from straightforward slashing into a strange dance of angles, pressure, leverage, and patience. A fully armored knight had only a handful of vulnerable points: the eyes, the neck, the armpits, the inside of the elbows, the groin, and sometimes the back of the knees. These were tiny gaps, often no wider than 2 fingers, and a knight had to know exactly where they were, both on himself and on his enemy. Because of this, combat became a game of hunting for openings rather than hacking wildly. And the real battlefield was a moving puzzle where you tried to maneuver your opponent until one of those tiny vulnerabilities slipped into reach. Imagine 2 armored men circling each other. their breathing loud within their helmets, their weapons clanging against plate in sparks that look dramatic but accomplish nothing. The blows glance off harmlessly, leaving deep dents but no blood. To kill someone in armor, you needed precision, not strength. You needed to know where the armor ended and where the flesh began. And because armor protected so effectively, knights used their weapons in ways that would look bizarre to anyone raised on movie battles. Most attacks weren't aimed at broad surfaces. They were aimed at seams. This is why swords became thrusting tools rather than cutting ones. Why daggers became instruments of grisly close-quarter work. Why poleaxes grew points, shaped like narrow spikes meant to punch through once, wedge deeply, and end the fight before anyone else could intervene. And the armor itself helped a knight stay calm while attempting these delicate maneuvers. Imagine knowing that even if your opponent lands a hit on your chest or shoulder, you'll probably be fine. That kind of confidence creates a very different fighting style. Knights stepped into blows deliberately, absorbing them so they could get close enough to launch a precise counterattack. They leaned into hits. They let weapons slide off them. Armor made them bold, sometimes dangerously bold. Many chronicles described knights who charged too aggressively, thinking their armor would save them from anything. But armor wasn't invincible. A well-placed blow, a lucky strike, or a coordinated attack from multiple enemies could still punch through, or knock a knight down, or damage a joint so badly that he couldn't rise again. What movies almost never show is how much grappling happened on a medieval battlefield. Knights didn't just fight with swords and axes. They wrestled, they shoved, they tripped each other. They grabbed the enemy's weapon arm, twisted it, locked it, turned the battle into a form of armored judo. Manual after manual from the Middle Ages teaches grappling techniques specifically designed to use the armor's weight and structure to your advantage. Some moves allowed a knight to throw his opponent to the ground with just a twist of the hips. Others were joint locks adapted for armored limbs. Some were brutal takedowns designed to pin an opponent long enough to slip a dagger through the visor slit. Armor created close combat, and close combat created an entire discipline that modern depictions completely ignore. A knight with a sword was dangerous, but a knight who dragged you close enough to smell the metal and sweat inside his helmet was far more terrifying. And the heavy armor the movies loved to portray as slow. In truth, it was built for mobility. A full suit of plate armor was articulated at nearly every joint. The elbows and knees were layered like the shell of an insect, bending smoothly. The torso plates overlapped to allow twisting. Gauntlets bent at the fingers. Even the legs had sliding rivets, so the plates could shift during movement. A trained knight could climb ladders, sprint across a field, dive for cover, or mount a horse from the ground without help. The idea of knights needing cranes to lift them onto horses is a complete myth, one born from later parade armor, designed for display, not combat. Real armor was practical, swift, and elegant in its own metallic way. When a knight moved, it wasn't the slow clatter of a tin can. It was the rhythmic whisper of metal sliding over metal, like a mechanical heartbeat echoing under layers of fatigue and adrenaline. But the armor also trapped heat, and heat killed more men than weapons sometimes. Inside the helm, with the visor down, a knight's breath became hot and damp, condensing in tiny droplets that ran down the inside of the metal like sweat from the walls of a cave. In summer battles, men fainted inside their armor long before they died of wounds. In winter battles, ice formed on the edges of helmets from steam freezing in the air. A knight might feel both suffocated and chilled at once. Armor protected, but it demanded a price. Every minute inside the suit drained energy, even when no one was fighting. By the time combat began, fatigue was already a hidden opponent, relentless, invisible enemy chewing away at stamina. This fatigue shaped combat. It made knights conserve movement, avoid wasteful swings, and rely on quick, efficient attacks. That's why the frantic movie-style flailing simply wouldn't happen. It wasn't just impractical, it was suicidal. A knight who wasted energy early in the fight risked collapsing later, becoming easy prey. The armor also influenced sound. The battlefield didn't ring with constant clashing blades, like popular culture suggests. Most hits made dull thuds, hollow echoes, or scraping growls where metal slid against metal. Inside a helmet, these noises weren't dramatic, they were oppressive. Each impact became a vibration that rattled through bone, traveled down the spine, or burst like thunder inside a confined space. The world narrowed into a private storm of noise, like being trapped inside a bell while someone struck it over and over. Many knights described feeling disoriented after prolonged combat, not because they were wounded, but because their senses were overwhelmed. Imagine fighting for your life while half deaf, half blind, drenched in sweat, and breathing air that feels too hot to swallow. That's what armor created: a sensory battlefield, as difficult as the physical one. Yet the armor gave a strange psychological edge. A knight enclosed in steel felt almost separate from his own flesh, like the armor became a second body, a shell that absorbed fear alongside blows. Chronicles mention knights who claimed to feel invincible once fully armored, as if the suit enclosed not only the body but also the mind. This confidence could be dangerous, but it also made knights fight with a steadiness modern people rarely understand. They weren't reckless. They were deliberate in a way, born from trust in the craftsmen who shaped their armor, trust in the hours of training that taught them how to move in it, trust in the idea that they could face an armed man and not die in the first exchange. And that confidence radiated outward. Armored knights intimidated enemies simply by existing. To face a knight was to face a moving fortress, a human being wrapped in the most advanced personal defense system of the medieval world. But all systems break under pressure, and armor had weaknesses that skilled fighters exploited ruthlessly. Poleaxes, especially halberds and poleaxes, were designed to pry, hook, and smash armor apart. The beak-like spike of a poleaxe could punch through plate if driven with enough force. The hammer side could dent armor so severely that bone broke beneath it even if the metal didn't. T-maces bypassed the problem of cutting entirely by using blunt force that transferred kinetic shock straight through the steel and into the body, and specialized arrows, shot from powerful warbows, could pierce thinner armor at close range. Armor was a shield, but the medieval world invented endless ways to challenge that shield. This arms race between protection and destruction shaped warfare for centuries, a metallic tug of war that never truly ended until gunpowder changed everything. Inside the armor, a knight's body bore the marks of battle even when the armor didn't. Bruises formed everywhere. The chest, stomach, thighs, arms, everything suffered. After a battle, a knight might remove his armor and discover purple and yellow blooms of bruising, spreading across his skin as if painted by some grim artist. Muscles trembled from strain, shoulders throbbed from absorbing impacts. Sometimes a blow that didn't penetrate the armor still cracked ribs. Sometimes a dent bent inward so far it pressed painfully into the flesh beneath. Armor didn't erase pain. It managed pain, controlled it, delayed it. And those who wore it learned to live with discomfort as casually as modern people carry phones in their pockets. Pain was part of the job. And the armor affected vision, too. Through the narrow eye slits of a visor, the world looked like a distorted tunnel. Peripheral vision nearly vanished, light dimmed. Everything felt narrower, more intimate. You didn't see the whole battlefield. You saw fragments, flashes of movement, glints of metal, dust kicked up by horses. This limited sight made fights unpredictable. Enemies appeared suddenly, close enough to smell. Allies could vanish as quickly as they came. A knight had to rely on instinct, training, and the muffled cries of comrades to understand what was happening. This tunnel vision created a feeling of being trapped in a world made entirely of iron, noise, and desperation. Perhaps the strangest part is this: armor didn't make battles safer. It made them longer, more exhausting, more grinding. In earlier ages, one sword stroke could end a fight, but with plate armor, fights became contests of endurance, skill, opportunity, and sometimes luck. The armor extended survival long enough for tactics, teamwork, and environment to matter far more. And it also meant knights expected to live through battle, not necessarily win, but survive. That expectation changed behavior. Knights took risks. They charged into formations, trying to break lines. They fought deeper into enemy territory, believing their armor would keep them alive long enough for rescue or ransom. And when they fell, the armor became both prison and salvation. Hard to move in when you're down, but hard for the enemy to kill through quickly. Many knights survived only because enemies couldn't finish them before reinforcements arrived. In the end, armor shaped medieval combat far more than any single weapon. It dictated which techniques worked, how close fighters got, which blows mattered, and which didn't. It turned battles into struggles of patience, precision, and endurance instead of quick, bloody duels. It made men bold and cautious at the same time. It wrapped warriors in both protection and vulnerability, and it quietly determined the rhythm of life and death on the battlefield. Rhythm almost nothing in modern storytelling captures accurately. If you want to understand knights, don't look at their swords first. Don't look at their horses or shields or banners. Look at the armor, the shining shell that became their second skin, their identity, their strength, and sometimes their final regret. Because once you understand the armor, everything else about knightly combat begins to make sense. Even the parts lost to time, buried under myth, or twisted into legend. The story always begins here, before the mud, before the shouting, before the crush of men and iron, at the moment when a knight lowers his lance and the world briefly holds its breath. If the sword is the symbol of knighthood, the lance is the reality, and it is a very different creature than the smooth, polished prop you see breaking harmlessly on a jousting field. The real lance, the one meant for war, was not refined, not delicate, and not ceremonial. It was a long ashwood spear, so heavy you could feel the weight tilt your balance even before you mounted your horse. It could run as long as 4 meters, sometimes even longer, and when 100 knights lowered theirs at the same time, the field bristled like the quills of some gigantic, furious beast. The knight's lance was not meant to be used for finesse or precision. It was meant to be used once, and used heartbreaking on impact if necessary, because its single purpose was to deliver the full force of a charging warhorse and the full momentum of a heavily armored warrior directly into the enemy line. When movies show knights charging with lances, they make the moment look like a ceremony, a grand announcement of war. But the truth was far grimmer. Before the charge, the world narrowed to a single point. The knight's vision through his visor slit, the faint tremor of the horse beneath him, the cold sting of air filling the gaps in his armor. A real war lance was not held under arm like a decorative flag. It was clamped tightly between the arm and the torso, anchored against the ribs, turning both rider and horse into a living projectile. When the knight lowered the lance, he was simply preparing to strike. He was locking himself into a commitment that could not be stopped once the horse began to gallop. The idea of pulling back did not exist. A charge was a promise made with your entire body, a promise sealed in a heartbeat and delivered in a violent flash of splintered wood and collapsing bodies. The power came not from the arm, but from the horse, the destrier, the great warhorse bred for strength, not speed. These animals were trained to run into walls of men, to ignore screams, to push through shields, to feel no fear where ordinary animals might panic. With the lance tucked rigidly against the torso, the knight's arm acted mostly as a guide, not as a source of power, and that made the lance unbelievably deadly. A thrust delivered by a running man might pierce a shield. A thrust delivered by a half-ton warhorse could break ribs even through armor, send men flying, or skewer to bodies in one stroke. Chroniclers describe charges that split enemy lines open like wet cloth, the first impact creating a ripple of shock that made even seasoned infantry falter. A knight with a lance wasn't just an individual fighter, he was a living missile. And when hundreds of such missiles descended upon a formation, there were often no poetic words to describe the aftermath, only broken shapes on the ground. But the lance had its own mysteries, its own subtleties. Before the charge, a knight had to choose his angle. You couldn't simply aim for the center of a man's chestnut, unless you were willing to risk burying the lance so deep that you couldn't retrieve it before being swarmed. A skilled knight angled the point slightly upward or downward, allowing the lance to glance off armor after impact. The goal wasn't always to stab, but to hit with crushing force, to unbalance, to break the enemy's formation. Even if the lance shattered, and it often did, that was considered success. A broken lance meant it had delivered its full momentum, and the splintering was not accidental. Many lances were deliberately hollowed or constructed with sections meant to crack, preventing the force from rebounding into the knight's arm and killing him with his own attack. The moment of impact is where movies fail most dramatically. They show clean hits, bodies flying in choreographed arcs, a sort of theatrical clarity. Reality was chaos and filtered, immediate. Imagine the violent snap of wood, the scream of a horse, the metallic grinding of armor struck by a force greater than any human strength. Imagine your own breath punching from your lungs as the lance meets resistance, the world jolting as though the earth itself has collided with you. In the milliseconds after the impact, the knight is no longer a charging warrior, but a man thrown forward in his saddle, desperately trying to stay mounted as his horse pushes past falling bodies. the lance is gone, either dropped or broken, and the knight must immediately transition to his next weapon. There is no pause, no dramatic moment to reflect. The battle sweeps him onward like a wave. This is where the true skill of a knight revealed itself. The lance was only the opening chord of the symphony of violence. Once it was gone, the knight had to draw his secondary weapon, sometimes a sword, often a mace or a warhammer, while still in motion, while still surrounded, while the world shrieked with noise. Many knights practiced this transition endlessly. Some could pull a new weapon within a second of losing the lance. Others weren't so lucky. They fumbled, hesitated, or lost their balance and fell from the saddle, often with fatal consequences. The battlefield did not reward hesitation. The moment after the lance's shattering impact was one of the most dangerous in a knight's life. It was the moment when he was weaponless, unbalanced, and surrounded by enemies now recovering from the blow. If he didn't regain control quickly, he became a target of opportunity. You can imagine how unpredictable the field looked at this moment. A knight on horseback wasn't alone. He was part of a wedge, a tightly packed formation of cavalry charging together. When the first row of lances struck, the second row crashed in behind them, and those behind followed, layer after layer, creating a shockwave that tore into whatever formation stood before them. This is why infantry dreaded cavalry, even when they carried long pikes. A perfect pike wall could stop a cavalry charge, but perfect formations rarely existed in the real confusion of war. Mud, hills, ditches, uneven terrain, fleeing men. Sudden impacts, any of these could open a gap, and one gap was enough. Knights trained to see those gaps and angle their horses toward them like water, finding a crack in a dam. Once inside, cavalry tore formations apart. But for all their power, cavalry charges were delicate. A single misstep of a horse, a hidden pit, a fallen body in the path could send a knight tumbling, and knights feared falling more than anything else. On the ground, surrounded by infantry, pinned under the weight of armor, a knight went from unstoppable force to trapped prey. That's why the lance mattered not only for attack, but for survival. The cleaner the charge, the longer the knight stayed mounted, and staying mounted meant life. The battlefield was not kind to those on foot, encased in heavy armor, and knights knew this intimately. Every charge carried with it the hope of breaking through and the fear of falling short. The psychological effect of the lance charge was just as important as its physical force. Imagine being an infantry soldier armed with a spear, maybe a shield, perhaps little armor, watching a wall of armored horses thunder toward you. You would feel the ground shaking beneath your feet. You would hear the clatter of armor long before you could see the faces behind the visors. You would know that a single moment of fear, a single backward step, could break your formation and doom your unit. Chroniclers write repeatedly about infantry fleeing not after being struck, but before. The charge itself, its sight, its sound broke morale more effectively than the lance points did. This was intentional. Knights were not only warriors but symbols. Their presence was meant to intimidate, overwhelm, crush the enemy's spirit before the weapons ever touched flesh. And yet the lance was also the most expendable weapon a knight carried. He expected to lose it. He expected it to shatter. The battlefield would be littered with broken shafts, splintered wood, twisted metal tips. Some lances snapped so violently that it would embedded itself in armor. Others stuck in shields like oversized needles. After a battle, the ground looked like a forest of broken trees. If the sword represented a knight's lineage, the lance represented the brutality of war, immediate, unforgiving, and short-lived. No one treasured a lance after a battle. It wasn't inherited, polished, or preserved. It was used, broken, discarded. That disposability is what made it effective. A weapon designed for one devastating moment did not need to survive beyond that moment. There were different kinds of lances too, each with its own purpose. The heavy couched lance was the most iconic, used in full-speed charges, but there were also lighter throwing lances used to disrupt formations before impact, shorter lances for tight spaces, and specialized lances for hunting skills that doubled as training for war. A knight learned to judge distance by throwing spears at boar. He learned to control fear by riding against charging animals. The hunt prepared him for the battlefield much more than any fencing practice. The lance was not just a weapon, it was part of a lifestyle centered around horseback combat. One of the most overlooked truths about the lance is that it was a two-sided danger. A misaligned charge could kill the knight as easily as the enemy. If the lance failed to glance off armor and instead stuck too deeply, The force could pull the knight out of his saddle, wrenching his arm or twisting his torso with a violence that shattered ribs. Some knights died not from enemy blades but from the sheer recoil of their own weapons. This is why the construction of the lance became a specialized craft. The wood had to be flexible enough to absorb shock, but firm enough to deliver force. Many lances had steel caps at the butt end, allowing the knight to balance the weapon, or even use it as a counterweight. Every detail mattered: length, balance, weight, grain, direction, even the kind of wood selected. If you could travel back to a medieval camp on the night before, at battle you would see squires checking lances with almost ritual care on fingers, along the shaft looking for cracks, ensuring the metal head was secure, testing the weight. They knew the lance's importance. They knew it would be the knight's first breath of combat. Some knights carried a sense of dread before the charge, not fear of the enemy, but fear of the unknown. Once the lance lowered, the next minute could decide his survival. No amount of training erased that. Knights were human, not the invincible statues conjured by later storytellers. Their fates often hinged on seconds, on split decisions made at full gallop, on the strength of a horse, on the reliability of a piece of wood. After the charge, after the lance was gone, something almost ritualistic happened. The knight became a different kind of fighter. Mounted or on foot, he now moved with weapons meant for close-quarter brutality. The lance was the knight's opening roar, but never the full story. It was the thunder before the storm, the first blow in a long chain of desperate, grinding violence. And though it lasted only seconds, those seconds shaped the entire flow of the battle. If you strip away the romance, the legends, the stained glass images of chivalric glory, you are left with this simple truth: the lance was the knight's true weapon of war, not because it was beautiful, or symbolic, or noble, but because it was effective. It broke lines, it broke men, it broke the silence before the killing began. And for as long as knights ruled the battlefield, armies trembled at the sight of that long wooden spear lowered and locked, the point aimed at the heart of their formation. The sword may be remembered, the armor may be admired, but the lance, anonymous, disposable, violent, was the real force that shaped medieval warfare. It was the first shock, the first fear, the first moment when everything changed. And though it rarely survives in museums, though it left no poems and few relics, the lance left something far more significant: the memory of a world in which courage, terror, and momentum collided in a single devastating instant. If you've followed the story so far, you already know the uncomfortable truth. The sword, the glittering symbol of chivalry, was almost never the weapon a knight trusted when the fate of his life balanced on the next heartbeat. Instead, knights reached for tools that looked brutally practical, even crude, to modern eyes. Weapons that didn't care about elegance or romance, but cared deeply about one thing: cracking open another armored human being with ruthless efficiency. And among all the medieval instruments shaped for that violent purpose, the poleaxe, the mace, and the warhammer held a place of quiet, terrifying honor. These were the weapons that understood armor, respected armor, and existed specifically to ruin armor. They didn't care about cuts or slashes or dramatic choreography. They cared about force, about channeling a knight's weight, skill, and grim determination into impacts that would shake bones, dent steel, and end a fight before exhaustion or bad luck could intervene. And what makes them truly fascinating is how misunderstood they've become. Because the movies simply don't like weapons that look this ugly and this honest. A poleaxe in the hands of a trained knight was not some clumsy farm tool. It was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering. A long haft about the height of a grown man, balanced with a narrow axe blade on one side, a hammer or spike on the other, and topped with a wicked spear-like point for thrusting. That meant one weapon could chop, pierce, pry, bludgeon, hook, trip, and stab. And the haft itself, often reinforced with iron strips, could be used to push, shove, choke, or deliver rib-crushing strikes. A poleaxe was a Swiss Army knife for armored combat, and it existed precisely because swords couldn't handle the job. Against plate armor, a sword's edge might fold, chip, or glance off harmlessly, but a poleaxe's spike concentrated all the force of a blow into a narrow point that could punch into gaps or dent armor so deeply that the person inside felt the shock, like a thunderbolt erupting in his chest. The hammerhead could knock a man off balance or crack a helmet. The axe could bite into mail or cut through shields. It didn't matter which way you swung it, the poleaxe always found something to break. But what truly made the poleaxe feared wasn't just the damage it dealt. It was the control it gave a knight over his opponent. Imagine two armored fighters closing in, the clatter of steel echoing around them as they step into each other's space. The poleaxe gave reach enough to strike before the enemy could get close, but once that distance collapsed, the haft could be gripped halfway down, suddenly turning the weapon into something shorter, more agile, almost like a two-handed club built for precision. Knights trained extensively in changing grips mid-fight, transitioning from long-range strikes to close-quarters techniques in a heartbeat. Manuscripts show fighters hooking the opponent's leg with the axe, jerking him off balance, then driving the top spike downward into his visor as he fell. Others show knights pinning enemies with the haft, then crushing their helmets with the hammerhead as casually as someone cracking a nut. The poleaxe wasn't about finesse, it was about intelligent brutality. A kind of cold efficiency movies almost never portray because it lacks the clean lines and pretty arcs of swordplay. But the real battlefield wasn't pretty. It demanded methods that worked, even if they felt grim, heavy, and uncomfortably final. Then there were maces, those blunt, almost primitive-looking weapons that seemed too simple to belong to the armored elite. But knights valued maces precisely because simplicity made them reliable. A mace could be solid iron or steel, with ridged flanges designed to concentrate force into armor-breaking edges. No blade to dull, no edge to maintain, no risk of snapping from a bad angle. Just a heavy head that transferred raw kinetic shock through steel plate, through padded gambesons, through bone, and finally into the mind of the unfortunate man being struck. Knights knew that armor didn't fully protect the human body, it protected the skin. The organs beneath were still vulnerable to blunt trauma, and a mace exploited that vulnerability viciously. A single powerful blow could crack ribs, dislocate shoulders, or knock someone unconscious even if their armor remained intact. Imagine the sound, not a clean metallic ring, but a sickening deep thunk, like someone slamming a fist into a metal drum. Imagine the sensation inside the armor, a sudden burst of pain, a moment of stunned confusion, the world spinning for reasons your brain can't immediately understand. That is why knights carried maces. They didn't need precision, they needed results. Hit hard, hit fast, hit through the armor rather than around it. Warhammer's smaller cousins of the poleaxe worked on the same principle. One side often had a hammer surface, the other a sharp beak-like spike capable of piercing plate. Unlike what movies show, knights didn't swing warhammers in huge, sweeping arcs. Big swings were slow, easy to dodge, and dangerous if you missed. Real warhammer strikes were small, compact, explosive motions delivered from the elbow and shoulder, quick, vicious bursts meant to overwhelm defenses and sneak past shields. A knight might hammer at an opponent's breastplate to stun him, then twist and drive the spike into the joint of the shoulder. Or he might hook the spike behind the knee, drag the opponent off balance. Then begin the brutally efficient work of finishing the fight while the enemy flailed helplessly on the ground. The warhammer did not care about elegance, it cared about leverage, angles, and the broken human body left in its wake. The real medieval battlefield was filled with these weapons. In fact, if you visited the aftermath of a fight, you'd find far more broken polearms, dented maces, and discarded hammerheads than swords lying around. Knights themselves preferred these weapons when death was close enough to smell, because they were simply better against armor than swords ever could be. And no knight with an ounce of sense wanted to waste precious seconds swinging a sword uselessly against curved steel plates when a hammer strike could end things instantly. Movies hide this reality because it feels too brutal, too grounded, too lacking in romance. But the knights of history didn't live in romance. They lived in mud, blood, exhaustion, and fear, and they clung to the weapons that gave them the highest chance of walking away alive. Another advantage of these weapons was psychological. Imagine seeing a man in full-plate armor striding toward you, gripping a poleaxe with silent confidence. Imagine watching the dented scars on the weapon's head, knowing each dent likely represents a blow that ended someone else's life. Swords looked noble, poleaxes looked hungry. A knight-wielding one didn't look like a hero. He looked like an executioner. That fear mattered. Warfare wasn't just physical, it was psychological. And knights used every advantage they could to shake the will of enemies before the fight even began. The sight of a well-armed knight approaching with a mace in hand could break morale faster than any shouted threat. You also have to understand something often forgotten. The knight was a professional warrior. not a noble fool wandering into battle with a shiny toy. He trained constantly. He practiced drills with poleaxes until the footwork became part of his nerves. He learned how to slide his hands along the haft to change leverage. He learned how to strike armor at angles that maximized damage. He learned where to aim on different kinds of armor: German, Italian, Gothic, Milanese, because each design had its own weak points. He learned how to adjust his weapon depending on ground conditions. Muddy ground favored shorter weapons. Rocky terrain favored spikes over hammerheads. Close formations demanded thrusting instead of swinging. This wasn't the romanticized, theatrical combat people like to imagine. This was systematic, calculated violence, shaped by decades of military tradition. The whole culture of knightly combat revolved around these weapons. Tournaments, real combat tournaments, not the sanitized jousting festivals of Hollywood, often included poleaxe duels, where knights tested themselves in brutal trials of endurance. They struck each other with such force that even spectators winced. Chroniclers describe helmets crushed inward like tin cups, shields shattered, men collapsing under the relentless rhythm of blows. These weren't staged performances. They were controlled battles that taught knights how far they could push themselves, how much shock they could absorb, how to react when a strike threw them off balance, how to exploit mistakes in the heat of fatigue. A sword duel might test skill. A poleaxe duel tested the soul. And knights respected these weapons. For that reason they revealed a man's true fighting spirit. Something else movies hide is how carefully knights maintained these weapons. A sword might be polished lovingly, but poleaxes needed constant inspection. The haft might crack, the rivets might loosen, the metal head might deform from repeated impacts. Knights sharpened spikes, hammered out dents, replaced shafts, rewound bindings, and checked every inch of their gear before a fight. They trusted these tools because they understood them intimately. A mace wasn't just a lump of metal, it was calibrated force shaped for survival. A warhammer wasn't just a brutal instrument, it was a precise tool for controlling the enemy's fate. The knight respected what he carried, and he relied on it more than any sword, because these weapons were forged for war, not ceremony. And there's another layer to this entire story. Knightly combat wasn't always one-on-one. More often, it was chaotic melee, where fighters clashed in loose clusters, broke apart, regrouped, and collided again. In that kind of chaos, you needed a weapon that could strike through the unpredictability, one that didn't require perfect angles or large spaces. A poleaxe could hook someone behind you without turning your head. A mace could deliver a deadly strike through a narrow opening. A warhammer could be used even while someone grappled with you. These weapons were designed for messy, real-world violence, not for the straight lines and clean duels the entertainment industry prefers. And here's a detail that might surprise you. Knights often used the haft of a poleaxe more than the blade. Striking with the wooden shaft was less dangerous than overcommitting to a full swing, and it allowed for rapid sequences of blows that disoriented the enemy. A haft strike to the face, a hook to the ankle, a hammer blow to the ribs. That was the rhythm of real knightly combat. It wasn't beautiful, but it was effective. The manuals show it clearly. The chroniclers hint at it quietly. The battlefield archaeology confirms it. These weapons didn't just wound, they controlled, they manipulated, they dictated the flow of combat in a way swords simply couldn't. So the next time you imagine a medieval knight riding into battle with a shining sword raised high, remember this: that sword was probably not the tool he expected to use. It was a backup plan, a symbol, a story. The real work, the grim, necessary work, was done with weapons that carried no romance but carried immense truth. Weapons that understood the problem armor created. Weapons that answered that problem with brutal, unflinching honesty. And if you truly want to picture a knight at the height of his power, don't imagine a gleaming blade. Imagine a poleaxe held in skilled hands, its metal head scarred from dozens of fights, its haft polished smooth from years of training. Imagine the heavy, rhythmic breathing inside a helmet. Imagine the sudden, explosive strike that dents a breastplate with a sound that echoes like a death knell. That is the real knight, not the polished hero of stories, but the hardened survivor of a world where only the weapons that worked were the ones worth carrying. It's strange, isn't it, how the image of the medieval knight always begins with the sword. Every painting, every movie, every bedtime story about shining armor and noble quests seems obsessed with that single blade, long, polished, elegant, resting at the knight's hip like a badge of honor. but out on an actual medieval battlefield. That symbol of prestige was more of a backup plan than a hero's main weapon. The sword was valuable, yes, sometimes worth months of wages, and it carried deep meaning about status, lineage, personal pride, even religious belief. But when arrows were falling, when mud swallowed boots, when spears shattered and men slammed into each other with the force of a charging horse, the sword was rarely the first thing a knight reached for. Tonight, we're going to peel back that layer of Hollywood shine and slip into the quiet, grim truth. The sword was a tool of survival, a last defense when things were going badly, when formations broke apart, when shields splintered, when the chaos came too close to manage. And the way knights actually used their swords tells us far more about fear, desperation, and human instinct than any triumphant movie duel ever could. Picture this moment. A knight stands in line among his fellow men-at-arms, armor clattering, visors down, the air thick with breath, and the damp reek of wool and leather. Ahead, the battlefield breathes like something alive, dust rising, horses stamping, the muffled thump of distant drums traveling through the ground. The knight holds not his sword, but a pole-along spear or a sturdy billhook, because the opening clash is about reach, not elegance. Every fighter knows it. You don't step into close range unless you must. You keep enemies away with long steel, with distance, with leverage. And in those early moments before the fighting closes in, the sword hangs quietly at the hip, like a reminder that the worst parts of the battle are still yet to come. The knight hopes truly, hopes not to need it. But battles are never organized for long. Lines warp. Noise shakes your breath. Someone, somewhere, falls. A spearhead snaps. A shield is lost in the crush. Suddenly, the distance is gone, and the enemy is too close, far too close. The kind of close where you smell their sweat, their breath, the iron temps of their blood. You can no longer plant your feet and swing a long staff weapon. The press of bodies is too tight. A spear won't angle properly. A poleaxe becomes awkward dead weight. This is the moment the sword was designed for. Not heroics, not dramatic wide swings, not leaping attacks. The sword was made for surviving the panic of close proximity, where there is no room for beauty, only quick, brutal movements meant to buy a breath, a heartbeat, a chance to stay alive in the choking darkness of armored bodies and clashing steel. Here is the part the movies almost never show. The sword was not used with exaggerated slashes, fancy spins, or slow, elegant exchanges. Real sword combat was fast, sharp, and almost brutally unceremonious. A knight in full armor rarely swung wide at all. Instead, the blade became something like a steel crowbar thrusted into gaps, jammed under visors, hammered against joints. Often, knights gripped their swords with both hands on the blade itself, using what was called the half-swording technique. Yes, hands on the blade, and no, the knight wasn't slicing himself open. These weapons weren't razor-sharp from hilt to tip. Only the very edges were sharpened, and armor, especially gauntlets, gave enough protection for this grip to work. Holding the blade halfway gave the knight control, precision, leverage. It turned the weapon into a short spear, perfect for punching through the vulnerable spaces where armor plates met. Imagine the feeling of that jaw glove against cold steel, fingers wrapped around the flat of the blade, the weight of the hilt pointed toward the ground. You're not swinging, you're driving the point like a nail into a crack between armor plates. It's intimate in a horrifying way. You're eye to eye with the enemy. You hear their breath rattle inside their helmet. One wrong move from either of you, and it's over. This is not the grand duel of legends. This is a cramped, panicked, shoving match, where survival depends on angles so small they disappear into the blur of motion. A thrust at the armpit, a jab under the chin, a stab into the groin where chainmail might be weaker. It's ugly, it's personal, and knights trained endlessly for it, because they knew the sword's true purpose, not glory, but ending the fight before the chaos could swallow them. And the weight so misunderstood by Hollywood. Swords weren't heavy. A typical knightly sword weighed somewhere around 2.5 to 3 pounds. Balanced, responsive, designed for thrusting as much as cutting. A knight could fight for hours with one without tiring his arm, but not because he used it constantly. He didn't. The sword was a finishing tool, not a primary one. When it came out, it meant things had gone sideways. It meant the lines had collapsed, the horse was lost, the lance shattered, the poleaxe too unwieldy in the tight crush of men. The sword was the weapon of a survivor, not the weapon of someone winning comfortably. There are stories, quiet, grim ones from the chronicles, that describe knights losing their main weapons and drawing their swords, only to find themselves trapped in the press. A knight might be pushed to his knees, another body might fall against him. He could be pinned so tightly he couldn't move his arm enough to strike, so he would thrust blindly, feeling for gaps, listening for a grunt, hoping he was hitting his enemy and not some unfortunate ally. Medieval combat wasn't controlled, it wasn't clean, it was a storm, and in that storm, the sword was more like a lightning rod, a way to strike through the chaos, hoping the blow landed where it needed to. Sometimes the sword wasn't used for cutting at all. Knights used the pommel, the heavy knob at the end of the hilt, as a hammer. They slammed it into helmets. They drove it into faces. The crossguard could be used to hook limbs or wrench open visors. The sword was a multi-tool long before the idea existed. It was whatever you needed it to be in the moment: a lever, a spike, a hook, a wedge. And this adaptability made it one of the most psychologically important weapons a knight carried. Even when it wasn't used often, its presence mattered. It was security, a final layer of control in a world that easily spun toward chaos. But let us step away from the violence for a moment and look at the sword's other role, one that shaped the myth far more than battlefield reality. The sword as a symbol of belonging. Knights were part of an elite military class. Their swords weren't just tools, they were emblems. A knight might inherit a sword passed down through generations. He might give it a name, etch a blessing into it, or take an oath upon it. The sword was bound to identity, not because it was the best weapon, but because it was the weapon that stayed closest to the knight's body at all times: at feasts, at ceremonies, at meetings, on journeys. The sword was always there. The poleaxe wasn't, the lance wasn't, the shield wasn't. Those tools came and went, but the sword, strapped to the hip, became almost an extension of the knight's shadow. And yet, the sword's symbolic weight had a hidden purpose. It kept the knight calm, knowing that even if everything else failed, you still had a reliable, familiar blade ready at your side. Gave a psychological edge. Even experienced fighters feared the moment when their poleaxe broke, when they lost the advantage of distance. But the sword meant you weren't finished. You still had a fighting chance. It was the anchor in the unpredictable swirl of steel and bodies, the last line of defense between you and the grave. Now imagine the end of the battle, dust settling, bodies scattered, the survivors limping through the wreckage of torn banners and fallen men. This is when you often see the sword, again, but not for fighting. The knight might rest on it like a walking stick, using the blade to support his weight. Or he might use it to cut away damaged pieces of armor, or to help a wounded comrade stand. The sword, after enduring the worst moments of the battle, became something gentle again, a tool for aid, not harm. It's strange how weapons can shift roles so quickly. Moments ago, it was a lifeline. Now, it's simply a piece of steel doing whatever the knight needs it to do in order to get home alive. And when the knight finally returns to his tent, exhausted, shaken, armor dented and stained, he might clean the sword carefully, wiping away mud and blood and grit. Maybe he whispers a prayer over it. Maybe he just sits silently with it across his knees, letting his heart beat slow. The sword sees a strange duality, both the terror of the battlefield and the quiet moments after it. A lance breaks, a spear is discarded, a shield is lost, but the sword stays from the first hour of preparation to the last breath of the day. That constancy matters. Even if the sword was rarely the star of the fight, it was always the silent companion of the knight's journey. In truth, the movies get one thing right. The sword is beautiful, but they're wrong about the beauty being in the swing. The real beauty was in the craftsmanship, the responsibility it carried, the weight of tradition, the knowledge that it might one day save a life or end when everything else had collapsed. A sword was elegance, hiding brutal intent, poetry wrapped around practicality. And maybe that's why we romanticize it so much. Because deep down, we like to imagine battles as personal duels, not chaotic storms. We want heroes, not survivors. We want clarity, not confusion. The sword fits the dream in a way that a spear never will, but the truth still stands, clear and unglamorous. The sword was a knight's last weapon, not his first. It was not the shining hero of the battlefield. It was the quiet one, the dependable one, the one you prayed you wouldn't need until you had no other choice. And understanding that simple fact reveals something deeper about medieval warfare, something raw, human, and honest. Knights didn't stride into battle seeking glory with their swords held high. They walked in hoping to avoid the moment when that blade had to come out, because when it did, it meant the fight had reached its most dangerous, most desperate, most personal peak. And in that narrow sliver of truth, in that desperate grip on cold steel, in that thrust toward a gap in armor, in that breathless struggle in the churn of bodies, you find the real medieval battlefield, not the movie version, not the legend, but the human one. A knight's shield is easy to overlook when we imagine medieval battle. It doesn't gleam like polished steel. It doesn't swing dramatically. It doesn't have the elegant mythology of the sword or the intimidating geometry of the poleaxe. A shield is simple, a slab of wood, a curve of iron, sometimes painted, sometimes battered, sometimes barely holding together by the end of a campaign season. And yet if you strip away the legends, if you push aside the romantic art and the heroic tales, the shield was the knight's real lifeline. It was the quiet, dependable companion that saved him more times than any sword ever did. It absorbed the world's violence so he didn't have to. It broke before he did. It was the difference between going home and being buried with the others. Tonight, we're slipping into the forgotten truth about shields and why knights, for all their love of shining steel, trusted humble wood more than anything else on the battlefield. Let's begin in a quiet moment, before the fighting starts. Imagine a knight tightening the straps of his shield, adjusting the weight, testing the balance. The shield sits close to his body, not hanging loosely. It becomes part of him. The grip is not gentle, his hand is buried deep inside sturdy leather loops. Fingers curled around a bar that will soon shake under blows hard enough to break bone. The shield's surface is scarred from past battles, thin cracks spidering across old paint, burn marks from fire arrows, gouges from blades that almost found their mark. Every scar holds a memory. Some scars belong to enemies who are long dead. Others belong to battles where the knight barely survived. The shield wears each story quietly, without pride, without ceremony. It just endures. Now picture the battlefield awakening. The rumble of horses, the drone of shouted orders, the hiss of incoming arrows. And in that rising chaos, what does the knight trust first? Not his sword, not his lance, not even the armor he paid a fortune to have forged. No, his shield, because the shield is the first line of truth. It doesn't lie. It doesn't fail easily. It doesn't require perfect aim or flawless timing. It stands between life and death in the simplest, most honest way imaginable, by getting hit instead of the man holding it. Movies show shields splintering instantly, or worse, thrown aside for dramatic duels. But in real medieval combat, a knight who dropped his shield was practically inviting death. Most combat wasn't about elegant technique, it was about surviving a relentless storm of hits. Spears, arrows, clubs, maces, axes, stones, everything flew toward the knight. And the shield, shaped sometimes like a heater, sometimes like a kite, sometimes like a simple round slab, absorbed the world's anger. It flexed under the weight of impacts. It cracked. It groaned, but it held. The shield's shape mattered more than people think. A long kite shield curved around the knight's body, protecting his leg, his torso, even part of his horse if he fought mounted. A smaller heater shield was lighter, easier to maneuver in the press of bodies. Some shields had metal rims to parry blades. Others had rawhide stretched over wood to stop splitting, but all shared the same philosophy. They turned the knight into a moving fortress. He wasn't just a man, he was a shape of wood and iron, advancing through chaos, using the shield like a wall he carried with him. You can imagine the weight, not just physical, but psychological. The shield becomes something like a guardian. You feel safer behind it, even when everything else is going wrong. It's the one object you can always trust to do its job, without hesitation. But that trust comes with responsibility. A knight needed to know exactly how much force the shield could take, how to angle it, how to turn it into an extension of his body, rather than a clumsy board. Holding a shield properly was an art. You didn't just raise it and hope. You kept your elbow tucked. You angled the surface downward so strikes slid off, instead of hitting directly. You used it to create openings, shove, push, control the space between you and the enemy. And when the press closed in, when shields smashed together and breath mingled violently, the shield was the key to not being swallowed whole by the crush. This is where the shield shows its strangest truth. It wasn't really used to block blows in the way movies show. It was used to deflect, to angle, to redirect. A flat block could break an arm, but a subtle tilt, a small twist of the wrist, could slide a spear off to the side or force a sword to glance away harmlessly. That's the hidden beauty of a shield. It wasn't passive. It was active, alive in the knight's hand, constantly moving in small adjustments, so he stayed protected. And here's something the modern imagination forgets. The shield wasn't just for defense, it was a weapon. A knight could punch with it. He could bash an opponent's face, knock them off balance, shove them into the mud, trap their weapon arm, or even pin them against another fighter in the crush. Some shields had metal bosses, a heavy raised dome in the center design, specifically for punching. Imagine the raw force of that hit, a steel-rimmed shield cracking into your jaw, driving your head backward in a spray of dirt and sweat. A blow like that could end a fight before it even began. Now, shift your mind deeper into the battle, into the choking swirl of bodies. The air is thick. The noise is unbearable, metal clanging, men grunting, the sickening thud of wood hitting bone. The knight is soaked with sweat inside his armor, breath damp and hot. The ground shakes, and in this chaos, the shield becomes a private world, a small, curved sanctuary that blocks out everything trying to kill him. Behind it, he can think, he can breathe, he can choose his next movement instead of reacting blindly. In the storm of confusion, the shield creates a sliver of control. This sense of control, however small, is everything. Because in medieval battle, losing control meant losing life. When formations broke, when lines collapsed, when panic rippled through the ranks, the shield was the anchor. Soldiers without shields clustered behind knights who still had theirs, pressing close to the one object that could push back the tide of violence. The shield wasn't just for the knight, it protected the man beside him, the man behind him, the man who had lost his own. Think for a moment about what that means. The shield wasn't just wood and iron, it was responsibility. A knight carried not just his own survival, but the safety of others. Behind a shield, younger fighters found courage. Without one, they often died fast, and knights knew this. They trained endlessly for it. They practiced forming shield walls, shield wedges, shield rotations. They learned to read the direction of incoming blows by the sound, by the pressure, by instinct. A shield was not simply held, it was lived with. But shields didn't last forever. They broke, splintered, burned, screamed under the weight of steel. And when a shield finally gave out, it wasn't a sudden, clean break. It was slow. A crack deepened, a strap loosened, a corner chipped off. Every time the shield failed just a little, the knight's heart rate changed. He felt it. He knew the danger creeping closer. And when the final break came, a spear punching through, or an axe biting deep enough to shatter the boards, the knight entered a new, terrifying stage of the fight. This is when he drew his sword, not in triumph, not for show, but because he had no other choice. The moment a knight lost his shield was one of the most dangerous moments of his life. The battlefield suddenly grew bigger, more hostile, more unpredictable. He could no longer trust anything to absorb the world's violence. Every hit came directly to him now. Even with armor, it was only a matter of time. Because armor dense, joints buckle, visors crack. The shield's loss was like being exposed to the cold air. After leaving a warm room, you feel naked, vulnerable, painfully aware of every threat. And so knights often retreated the instant their shield broke. Not out of cowardice, but survival. There are quiet records from chroniclers describing men desperately grabbing broken shields off the ground, even ones that weren't theirs, trying to hold together the splintered remains for just a few more heartbeats. A cracked shield was still better than none at all. It could still deflect a glancing blow, still shield a vital joint, still give the fighter a psychological anchor. Sometimes the smallest sliver of wood meant the difference between staggering away from the battlefield or being left behind in the mud. And yet, shields weren't always the same. As armor improved, especially plate armor, some knights fought without shields altogether. They relied on mobility, on two-handed weapons, on the solid metal that wrapped their bodies. But even then, in the era of full plate, many knights still brought shields to war. Why? Because even the best armor didn't protect everything, and no matter how well forged a breastplate was, nothing matched the comfort of holding a barrier you could move freely, angle instinctively, and hide behind when the world became too loud to think. Off the battlefield, the shield carried a story of identity. It bore heraldic symbols, colors, and shapes that declared lineage, allegiance, honor. But in battle, Those beautiful designs were scratched and torn within minutes. Mud smeared across them. Blood, sometimes the knight's, sometimes someone else's, stained the paint. And by the end of the day, the shield looked nothing like the proud emblem that left camp in the morning. That transformation tells its own quiet truth. Symbols mattered in times of peace, but survival overshadowed everything in times of war. There's a strange kind of intimacy to the shield's role. It's not a weapon that reaches outward. It's a shell that guards inward, and that makes it deeply human. It's instinct, carved into wood. Humans hide behind things when frightened. They seek cover. They protect the heart, the face, the lungs. The shield is the physical embodiment of that instinct. A knight holding a shield wasn't a hero. He was a human being trying to keep breathing. Now step into the final moments of battle. The noise fades. The adrenaline drains. Survivors lift their shields, heavy with dents and weight, and look around at the wreckage. The ground is a graveyard of broken wood and arrow shafts. Many shields lie abandoned, cracked open like fallen shells. Those shields saved lives, quietly, without credit, without myth. A knight might stand over his own shield, touching the cracks with a strange gratitude. It did its job. It gave everything it had. And tomorrow, if he lives to see another dawn, he will repair it, repaint it, and carry it again, knowing it will once more take the world's blows, so he doesn't have to. That's the truth of the knight's shield. Not glamorous, not heroic, but deeply, painfully essential. It was the simplest tool and the most important one. When the movies show knights discarding their shields for dramatic duels, they misunderstand the core of medieval combat. Knights didn't dream of sword fights under moonlight. They dreamt of going home, and nothing helped them do that better than the battered, heavy, humble shield strapped to their arm. When you understand that, the shield's quiet power becomes clearer than any story of shining armor or noble duels. It wasn't a symbol. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't for show. It was the one companion a knight never wanted to lose. When most people picture a medieval knight, the image begins with a horse. A gleaming steed beneath polished armor, the knight poised with lance or sword, charging across a sunlit field as arrows and enemy soldiers fall away like shadows. But the truth of mounted combat is far more complicated, far more terrifying, far more chaotic than any Hollywood sequence ever shows. It's not a story of elegant lines and synchronized gallops. It's a story of weight, momentum, fear, and unpredictability of living creatures reacting to pain, noise, and confusion, both human and animal, in a violent ballet that can break in an instant. To understand how knights actually used lances, swords, and other weapons on horseback, you have to step beyond the romantic lens and enter the pounding, terrifying reality of the battlefield, where horses are not props, armor is a cage, and a split-second mistake can end everything. Begin with the horse. A knight's mount was not simply a noble creature bred for beauty. It was a war horse, trained to carry not only a fully armored human weighing 300 pounds or more, but also the additional weight of weapons and protective barding that could easily double the horse's burden. Some of these animals reached upwards of 16 to 17 hands, height, muscular and intimidating, but that height and muscle came with consequences. Movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting for the animal. The moment armor encumbered it, even slightly, the horse's stamina drained, and because the knight often relied on momentum as much as skill, maintaining balance during a charge required constant communication through leg pressure, reins, and subtle shifts of weight. The knight could not simply ride recklessly. A misstep could unseat him entirely, especially when fighting in the midst of uneven terrain, mud, or the tangled bodies of other horses and men. And yet, to the untrained eye, it all looked smooth and majestic, till someone misjudged a stride and the chaos hit in full. The lance is the first tool in this high-stakes equation. Unlike the Hollywood version, where a knight tilts it casually and shatters shields in a single strike, the lance required precise alignment, impeccable timing, and a keen understanding of distance. Knights used lances not as blunt instruments, but as carefully directed weapons designed to exploit the horse's speed and the enemy's vulnerabilities. The idea wasn't to hack wildly. It was to hit at the exact moment the horse's momentum carried both rider and weapon into the optimal angle, targeting gaps in armor, shield edges, or exposed limbs. And even then, a lance was rarely a kill-and-impact weapon. Its power could knock an enemy backward, unseat him, or pin a shield, but it rarely finished a fight outright. Most mounted battles required a follow-up. The knight would close with a sword, a mace, or a hammer, turning the horse's momentum into leverage to control the enemy. What looks simple on a movie screen, the flash of a lance splitting a formation, is actually the result of thousands of practiced hours learning to ride, balance, and strike simultaneously under immense pressure. And the reality of the battlefield complicates all of this further. Horses, no matter how well trained, are animals first. They react to sounds, sudden movements, pain, and the instinct to flee. Imagine a horn blaring nearby, a fallen rider thrashing on the ground, another horse kicking wildly in panic. Even the best trained destrier can bolt, stumble, or rear, throwing the knight into chaos. Knights had to account not only for their own movements, but for the animal beneath them, and for the unpredictable reactions of friend and foe alike. Mounted combat was a three-way partnership: rider, horse, and weapon working as a single unit. Fail in any one component, and the result could be catastrophic. Horses could crush men underfoot, knights could collide, and the precise choreography of lance and momentum could collapse in an instant. And yet, despite the danger, the mounted charge was a primary tactic in medieval warfare, precisely because it could dominate infantry formations when executed properly, turning mass, speed, and steel into terrifying force. The preparation for a charge required careful observation and strategy. Knights rarely charged at random. They studied terrain, timing, and enemy positions. A deep, muddy field could sap the horse's energy. A narrow approach could funnel a charge into disaster, and the human psychology of the enemy mattered too. A disciplined infantry could counter cavalry effectively with pikes or stakes, breaking horses' rhythm and throwing knights off. A poorly organized group might crumble before the shock of the charge, giving knights the opportunity to exploit openings with sword, mace, or even the horse itself. Mounted combat was not simply about courage. It was about calculation, adaptability, and anticipating variables that could shift in a heartbeat. And let's talk about the weapons in hand, beyond the lance. Once the initial momentum dissipated, once the enemy shield or line deflected, collapsed, or absorbed the impact, the knight needed secondary weapons. Often, this was a sword designed for the chaos of close quarters. But unlike the controlled duels of movies, mounted sword fighting was clumsy, awkward, and extremely dangerous. A misjudged swing could unbalance the knight, strike his own horse, or leave him open to counterattacks. Knights learned to use short stabbing motions when possible, leveraging the horse's speed and the combined weight to drive points into armor gaps. Other weapons, maces, warhammers, even the blunt edge of the shield, were adapted for horseback strikes. The horse added height and weight, but also instability. Every attack had to account for the rocking of the animal's back, the jerks from uneven ground, the push from nearby combatants, and the possibility that the horse itself could be injured mid-fight. Mounted combat also demanded extreme endurance. Charges were often short bursts, but they were physically and mentally exhausting. A knight had to maintain focus over the roar of battle, the sweat of exertion, the fear of falling, and the coordination of horse, weapon, and the armor that protected him simultaneously restricted movement, drained energy, and contributed to heat exhaustion. Horses could falter from fatigue, overheat from exertion, or panic from environmental stimuli. Knights who survived one charge often had to regroup rapidly, assess damage to themselves and their mounts, and plan for the next encounter, sometimes multiple times in a single day of battle. It's no wonder many knights entered combat with reserves of stamina, a careful plan for pacing, and an intimate understanding of how much energy both they and their horses could expend before collapse became likely. And then there's the unpredictability of allies and enemies. On a battlefield, knights rarely fought in isolation. Squads of cavalry, disorganized infantry, archers, and other knights moved in overlapping chaos. Horses collided, shields blocked intended strikes, lances splintered, screams erupted. Knights needed an almost supernatural awareness of their immediate surroundings. A single misstep, rider or horse could cascade into disaster. Yet despite all this, the cavalry charge remained central to medieval tactics. It was violent, messy, and terrifying, but when executed with skill, it could rout formations, break morale, and exploit openings that infantry weapons could not. And this is a point movies almost never convey. The chaos wasn't cinematic, it was lethal, constant, and governed by survival instincts, far more than theatrical grace. The psychological impact of mounted combat was profound. Horses, because of their size and motion, became weapons themselves. The sight of a wall of armored knights galloping toward you, lances leveled, hooves thundering, often broke infantry morale even before engagement. Knights understood this, and training included maximizing fear as much as damage. Positioning, timing, and the combination of horse and rider were tools of intimidation, carefully calibrated to create openings in enemy lines. A knight's effectiveness was as much about the threat he projected as the strikes he could land. The relationship between knight and horse is often overlooked in narratives, but was absolutely central. A horse that panicked or faltered could end a knight's life instantly. For that reason, knights spent years training with their mounts, building mutual trust. Horses were conditioned to noise, steel, weight, and chaos. They were taught to charge through smoke, mud, and human bodies, but they were still living creatures, capable of fear, stubbornness, and unexpected reactions. A knight had to anticipate his horse's behavior as much as the enemy's, learning subtle cues in posture, breathing, and motion that could mean the difference between survival and death. Every successful maneuver on horseback was a testament to both human skill and equine intelligence working in tandem. And yet, even with all this preparation, battles rarely unfolded perfectly. A charge that worked on paper might fail spectacularly in reality. Horses could stumble over unseen ditches, misjudge terrain, or refuse to enter certain zones. Knights could collide, weapons could break, and what was meant to be a coordinated strike could devolve into a desperate melee. The mounted knight's life was a constant negotiation between precision, adaptation, and luck. Survival depended on reading the battlefield, trusting the horse, executing under pressure, and using every advantage that training and instinct could provide. There are chronicles that describe entire campaigns where the cavalry's impact was neutralized simply by terrain or unexpected disorder. A muddy field could sap horses' energy in minutes. Dense forests prevented momentum from being built. Defensive stakes or pike formations could pierce horse or rider, halting charges and when a mounted knight fell whether struck by weapon, unbalanced, or thrown from a panicked horse, the vulnerability was extreme. Other knights and infantry could trample, stab, or strike him before he recovered. Horses could panic and crush nearby fighters. The elegance of the mounted knight in films is replaced by the brutal truth of collapse, confusion, and survival instincts dominating every action. Mounted combat, in its most honest form, was a constant tension between force and fragility, momentum and balance, predator and prey. Knights relied on the combined power of horse, lance, and training, but the environment, enemy, and sheer unpredictability of war created an endless series of variables that could kill in an instant. And yet, in spite of the danger, cavalry charges were central to medieval strategy. They were devastating when successful, shaping the course of battles, campaigns, and even entire wars. The mounted knight was not a hero in the romantic sense. He was a practitioner of controlled violence, a master of chaos, a man who balanced human skill and equine instinct in a way that movies can barely imagine, let alone depict accurately. Finally, consider the aftermath. Surviving mounted combat required more than just reaching the end of a charge. Horses were injured, exhausted, or dead. Knights had to regroup, tend wounds, repair equipment, and make decisions in the midst of continuing danger. Even in moments that might look like victory from a distance, the battlefield remained chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous. The mounted knight's life was never safe. It was a constant negotiation with gravity, momentum, fear, and the ever-present threat of collapse. When people think of knights fighting, they imagine polished swords, shining armor, and dramatic duels. But the truth of medieval combat was much less glamorous and far more terrifying. For every knight wielding a sword in close quarters, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds, armed with poleaxes, axes, or blunt weapons designed not for elegance, but for one goal: survival. These tools were heavy, unwieldy, and merciless in their application. They demanded strength, endurance, and a deep understanding of leverage and positioning. And, perhaps more importantly, they revealed the truth that battles were less about heroism and more about raw, calculated efficiency in the face of chaos. Let's begin with poleaxes. The term encompasses a variety of long-shafted weapons: halberds, glaives, billhooks, and pikes. To the untrained eye, they look unwieldy, clumsy extensions of the human body, but they were precision instruments when handled by skilled fighters. Unlike swords, which excelled in the close crush of bodies, poleaxes created distance. They allowed a knight, man-at-arms or foot soldier to strike without exposing themselves fully, to probe enemy lines, and to control space in ways that a sword could never achieve. And on the battlefield, control of space was life or death. The first moments of engagement were often about preventing an enemy from closing distance, and a poleaxe gave its wielder that crucial edge. Even one misstep could be fatal, so wielding these long weapons required constant awareness of footing, enemy positions, and the pressure of the fight around you. Imagine the chaos of the first clash. Soldiers from both sides surge forward, boots sinking into mud, hooves pounding nearby, armor scraping, spears and halberds clash. A single thrust could pierce a vulnerable joint or knock an opponent off balance. But more often, the battlefield isn't clean, isn't predictable. Weapons meet shields, blades glance off armor. The poleaxer must twist, push, and angle his weapon precisely to keep it from becoming useless. A halberd is more than a stabbing instrument, can hook shields, trip opponents, push riders off balance, or batter their armor. It's a multifunctional weapon in the truest sense, designed for versatility in a storm of movement and noise. And for knights trained to fight in this environment, it's almost an extension of the body. The arm and the weapon moving in tandem, anticipating each enemy reaction before it even happens. Axes, in contrast, were brutally simple. Where poleaxes offered reach and control, axes delivered concentrated impact. A single swing could crush a shield, dent armor, or even split a helm. Weight and momentum mattered far more than finesse. Knights or men-at-arms wielded axes with both hands when necessary, letting gravity and body mechanics amplify the strike. In the press of combat, when lines broke and the crush of bodies made thrusting weapons impractical, axes were devastating. Unlike the half-swording technique of the sword, axes required broad, often unpredictable movements, which could create openings by sheer force and chaos. But this same power made them dangerous for the wielder as well. A misstep or overextension could leave him exposed, unbalanced, and vulnerable. Every swing demanded precision, strength, and timing. Even in the chaos of combat, there's a particular element of intimacy with these weapons that's rarely discussed. They are not graceful. They are intimate because they bring the knight into the closest possible contact with danger, both his own and his enemies. A halberd jabbed between the shoulders, an axe swung at the side of a helmet, a billhook hooked under a shield edged. These strikes are measured not by beauty, but by the precise understanding of anatomy, armor, and momentum. The battlefield becomes a series of micro-decisions, each movement calculated to survive, to incapacitate, to create breathing space. And, unlike swords, these weapons often didn't require the elegance of a thrust or swing. They demanded ingenuity in moments of panic, leveraging the environment, the bodies around, and even gravity to turn ordinary materials into lethal extensions of the knight's will. Poleaxes were particularly important in group formations. Think of the classic phalanx or pike square. Knights and infantry arranged in disciplined lines could extend long spears outward, creating barriers that slowed enemy charges, prevented flanking, and allowed secondary weapons to be used behind the wall of steel. These formations were not just strategic, they were psychological. Facing a wall of poleaxes was terrifying. It broke morale even before blood was shed, and the discipline required to maintain these formations under duress was immense. Any disruption, a trampled foot, a broken weapon, a horse running wild, could collapse the line entirely. Knights trained for this, understanding that their weapons' effectiveness depended not only on personal skill, but on the cohesion of the entire group. Axes, on the other hand, were less about formation and more about adaptation. In the chaos of the press, where lines of spears broke or terrain made long weapons unwieldy, an axe could be swung in confined spaces. It could hook, smash, and puncture. It could finish off an opponent already weakened by a poleaxe or sword. Its simplicity belied its efficiency, and because the battlefield often collapsed into these tight, personal encounters, axes became surprisingly common despite their lack of elegance. Strength and courage mattered more than technical finesse, though both helped. An axe in a skilled hand was terrifyingly precise, capable of cutting through shield, armor, and bone with terrifying efficiency. But neither weapon was a guarantee. Both required awareness of their limitations. A polem in a swampy, uneven field could be cumbersome, easily caught in mud or tripping over an obstacle. An axe could be slowed or misdirected if the opponent maneuvered quickly or if a nearby fighter inadvertently interfered. The battlefield is not controlled. It's unpredictable. Knights had to train constantly, not just in technique, but in reading situations, anticipating chaos, and adapting to whatever was happening around them. The weapons were only as effective as the mind and body wielding them, and mistakes were often fatal. The psychological weight of these tools cannot be understated. Holding a polem, a knight feels the balance, the weight, the reach. It is an extension of the arm, the will, and the mind. It creates confidence, but also a terrifying awareness of consequence. One misjudged angle, one slip in the press, could result in his own limb being trapped or crushed. With axes, the swings are deliberate, but always shadowed by the risk of counterattack, overreach, or fatigue. Every strike is a commitment, every movement a gamble. In a way, these weapons sharpened instinct and endurance far beyond what polished sword duels could teach. They demanded attention, precision, and a constant negotiation between aggression and survival. There's a strange intimacy between knight and weapon in this context. Unlike swords, which could be half symbol, half utility, polems and axes were brutally honest. They didn't offer aesthetic satisfaction. They didn't represent status in the same dramatic way. They demanded effort, skill, and the constant acknowledgement that your survival was tied directly to the precise application of leverage, strength, and judgment. Every swing, thrust, or hook was a negotiation with gravity, momentum, and the chaos of flesh and metal surrounding you. And in that negotiation, a knight's understanding of his own limits became as crucial as understanding the enemy's. Then there's the aftermath. After hours of engagement, polems and axes bear the scars of combat. Wood splinters, iron chips, shafts crack. Every mark is a story, a testament to the chaos endured. Knights and soldiers often repaired, sharpened, and reinforced their weapons before returning to the field. Unlike swords, which were often treasured as heirlooms, polems and axes were utilitarian first. Their value was measured in reliability and effectiveness, not elegance. Yet their effectiveness often shaped the outcome of battles more directly than any sword could. They were the engines of survival and destruction in the hands of trained warriors, and consider the integration of these weapons with other tools. Shields, for instance, were used in tandem with axes or polems, creating layered defense and offense. Knights didn't swing blindly. They pushed, held, deflected, and jabbed. Every movement was an adaptive strategy, informed by both instinct and years of training. Polems could keep an enemy at bay long enough for a sword to finish the work. Axes could shatter a shield, creating openings for a lance thrust or a short stabbing weapon. These combinations highlight the practicality over the romance of medieval combat. Skill was often measured in adaptability, not flair. Finally, we must return to the human element. These weapons are terrifying in their design, but the real danger comes from the humans using them. Knights and soldiers were trained to use these tools under exhaustion, pain, and fear. They fought alongside allies and against strangers who shared similar training and desperation. Fatigue, panic, miscommunication, and the unpredictability of the battlefield transformed these weapons from simple tools into instruments of life and death negotiation. Mastery required more than physical strength. It required anticipation, spatial awareness, timing, and the ability to manage stress under extreme conditions. And even then, mastery was no guarantee of survival. The battlefield remained chaotic, violent, and unpredictable, with the weapons serving as extensions of the human mind as much as the arm. Polems and axes tell us a deeper truth about medieval combat. It was less about heroics, chivalric gestures, or cinematic duels, and more about efficiency, adaptability, and survival under extreme conditions. Knights and soldiers weren't dancing across open fields in choreographed battles. They were calculating, improvising, and reacting in the midst of a storm, using every tool at their disposal, knowing full well that the difference between life and death often came down to how effectively they wielded a piece of wood or iron. These tools were not glamorous, they were brutally honest, demanding, and deadly. And yet, they shaped the course of battles, campaigns, and history itself. The real lesson is this: to understand medieval combat, You cannot look only at swords, armor, or cinematic depictions. You must consider the full spectrum of weapons and their practical application, the reach of the poleaxe, the crushing impact of the axe, the way these tools responded to human instinct, momentum, and error. The battlefield was an ecosystem of chaos, and the tools adapted to it, just as the knights and men-at-arms adapted themselves. In that adaptation lies the truth, and in that truth lies the reason these weapons mattered more than any legend. When most people think of knights in battle, the mind automatically jumps to clashing swords, arcing lances, and the thunder of hooves on open fields. The drama of cinematic combat focuses on clean strikes, heroic duels, and the elegance of steel slicing through air. But the truth of close combat in the medieval battlefield is far more grueling, intimate, and chaotic than any film has ever captured. There were no slow, choreographed swings in the press of men, no shining moments of personal glory. Instead, knights were engulfed in a crushing melee of bodies, weapons, mud, and armor, relying on raw strength, technique, and instinct to survive. Close combat was a fight for life, often fought with a combination of weapon, shield, and sheer human ingenuity, sometimes with the very body itself acting as a weapon. Close combat often began when lines of battle collapsed into chaos. Formations, whether shield walls or cavalry-supported infantry, broke under fatigue, pressure, or unexpected attack. Suddenly, knights and men-at-arms found themselves in what is called the press, a mass of bodies pushing and shoving, weapons intersecting, horses stumbling over fallen men, shields knocking against one another. It was here that the most brutal and intimate forms of fighting occurred. The battlefield was no longer open and spacious. It was a suffocating, claustrophobic mess where every movement counted and one misjudged step could mean death. In these moments, the knight's skill wasn't measured by the elegance of his swing but by his ability to read, react, and survive within an unpredictable, ever-shifting human tide. Grappling was a central aspect of this type of combat, something rarely depicted in modern portrayals. Knights were encased in armor, and while metal offered protection against slashing and piercing weapons, it could also restrict mobility. In the press, swords often became cumbersome, and fighting relied more on leverage, strength, and positioning than on cutting power. A knight might grab an opponent's arm, shield, or weapon to control their movement, twist them into the ground, or disarm them. Grappling required acute awareness of one's own body, the armor's limitations, and the opponent's reactions. Every pull, shove, or hold was a negotiation of balance, weight, and momentum, often deciding whether a knight could survive the next few seconds or be crushed beneath the press of bodies. And unlike the controlled grappling scene in staged duels, this was real, raw, and dangerous. Armor could catch awkwardly, fingers could be broken, and any distraction might leave one vulnerable to nearby weapons. Knights also employed strikes in tight quarters that often looked clumsy but were brutally effective. A punch with a gauntlet, a hammer blow with the back of a sword, or a thrust with a dagger into an exposed joint could turn the tide of a personal skirmish. In the press, vertical swings were often less effective than downward or lateral strikes designed to exploit openings in armor. Timing was crucial. Too early, and the blow might glance harmlessly off. Too late, and the opponent would counterattack. The intimacy of this combat meant that knights were constantly aware of both the weapons in their hands and the vulnerable spaces around them. Eyes darted constantly, legs braced for unsteady footing, arms twisted to maintain control over both shield and blade. The battlefield became a tangle of strategic improvisation, where instinct and muscle memory dominated over theory or elegant form. Shields played a unique role in this chaos, even more so than in open formations. In the press, a shield could shove, pin, or block in ways that didn't resemble cinematic depictions. Knights used shields to create space, push enemies off balance, trap weapons, or protect vulnerable joints during grappling. It was an extension of the body, manipulated constantly to negotiate angles and openings. A poorly held shield could mean immediate injury, as enemy strikes found gaps in armor or pinned the knight against other combatants. Conversely, a well-positioned shield could be a lifeline, allowing a knight to maneuver within the press, deliver strikes, and maintain a semblance of control in an otherwise uncontrollable environment. Close combat also emphasized the use of secondary weapons that could be wielded in confined, unpredictable circumstances. Swords, when available, were often employed with short thrusts rather than sweeping swings, exploiting armor gaps in the torso, limbs, or joints. Daggers were invaluable when swords were impractical, used for precise stabs into mail or underarmor plates. Even blunt weapons like maces or warhammers had their place, delivering concussive force to unprotected areas or against heavily armored foes. Knights learned to transition between weapons fluidly, adapting to openings that appeared for only fractions of a second. Every move required rapid decision-making, awareness of the surrounding melee, and a keen understanding of human anatomy, armor mechanics, and the limitations of one's own body. One of the most overlooked realities of close combat was the psychological component. The press was terrifying, with the constant threat of being crushed, stabbed, or trampled. Panic spread quickly, as a single faltering soldier could create a domino effect, toppling knights and men-at-arms alike. Knights had to maintain not only physical control, but mental focus, pushing through fear, pain, and exhaustion to continue fighting effectively. The ability to stay calm under these conditions was often as decisive as technical skill, and experienced knights sometimes survived situations where raw strength alone would have failed. Fear was omnipresent, but so was the drive to survive, and this psychological endurance shaped the effectiveness of knights more than any single weapon ever could. Another critical aspect of close combat was the use of terrain and the environment. Knights were not fighting on pristine fields. They fought in mud, over uneven ground, amidst fallen soldiers and horses. Every step could be a hazard. Knights learned to use the environment to their advantage, pressing an enemy against obstacles, leveraging a fallen foe, or using terrain to limit exposure. Grappling, pushing, and striking were constantly influenced by these variables. What might seem like random chaos from a distance was often a series of micro-decisions, exploiting every opportunity for survival. Each knight became a master of adaptation, responding to movement, balance, and chance with instinct sharpened through training and experience. The physical toll of close combat cannot be overstated. Armor, while protective, was heavy and restrictive, sapping energy and making sustained fighting exhausting. Knights had to manage their stamina carefully, alternating between bursts of forceful grappling or striking and brief moments of repositioning or breathing. Weapons like maces and axes were effective, but their weight compounded fatigue, especially when swings were repeated in rapid succession. Even a single miscalculated move could leave a knight vulnerable, not just physically but in terms of positioning and balance within the press. Endurance, timing, and efficiency were as critical as the weapons themselves. Close combat also revealed the improvisational nature of medieval fighting. Knights adapted their techniques to the immediate circumstances, improvising ways to manipulate shields, redirect weapons, or use the opponent's momentum against them. Grappling might involve using an enemy's weapon as leverage, twisting armor joints to create openings, or leveraging the press of bodies to push an opponent into an exposed position. Every action was an experiment in survival. Training provided the knowledge base, but instinct, quick thinking, and experience determined success in these moments. The chaos of battle created unpredictable patterns, and those who could read and adapt often survived while the unprepared perished. Interestingly, much of the mythology surrounding knightly dueling falls apart under scrutiny in this context. Romantic images of chivalric combat rarely account for the suffocating proximity, the randomness of strikes, or the intense physicality of grappling. Duels in real battles were brutal, unrefined, and messy, and victory often depended less on honor or etiquette than on exploiting small openings, leveraging weight, and using sheer force effectively. The human body, both attacker and defender, became a weapon, as did the armor, the shield, and the immediate environment. Survival required total awareness, stamina, and adaptability far beyond the simple choreography suggested in popular imagination. Close combat also underscores the relational aspect of medieval warfare. Knights often fought alongside men-at-arms, forming temporary alliances in the press. Coordination, even in microbursts of seconds, could mean the difference between life and death. Shields could protect allies as well as oneself. Grapples could redirect enemies into the paths of fellow combatants. And yet, the press was always chaotic, with alliances and formations dissolving unpredictably under pressure. Each knight had to negotiate not only with enemies but also with friends and strangers. constantly assessing risk and opportunity in a swirling, unpredictable human tide. Finally, consider the aftermath of close combat. Surviving the press left knights physically and mentally drained, often with injuries, bruises, and broken equipment. Weapons were dulled, shields cracked, and armor dented. Knights emerged alive, but only barely, carrying the scars of both weapon and environment. The intensity of grappling, striking, and survival in confined, chaotic spaces left lasting impressions on bodies, on minds, and on tactics. Lessons learned in these micro-conflicts often informed future strategies, weapon choices, and the constant evolution of battlefield techniques. Close combat was, in essence, a test of human endurance, adaptability, and ingenuity. It was intimate, exhausting, and terrifying, a world where skill, instinct, and psychological resilience determined survival as much as weaponry or armor. Knights did not fight elegant duels, they survived chaos, leveraged every advantage, and transformed even the most basic tools, the shield, the sword, the gauntlet, into extensions of their will. In the press, the battlefield stripped away romance and revealed the true mechanics of medieval warfare: unrelenting, personal, and brutally effective. When you imagine medieval battles, it's easy to focus on the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, and the chaos of close-quarters fighting. The knight in gleaming armor, sword raised, charging into the fray. That image dominates popular imagination. But what movies rarely show is the invisible, constant threat that hung over every knight. Missiles, arrows, bolts from crossbows, and even thrown spears created a silent, invisible pressure that could disrupt formations, pin cavalry, and kill as efficiently as the closest strike. Surviving this unseen threat required not just courage in armor, but strategy, adaptability, and a deep understanding of the battlefield environment. It was a deadly dance, and one misstep could turn a confident advance into chaos. Consider the longbow, one of the most feared weapons of its era. A skilled archer could send arrows soaring hundreds of meters, raining down upon knights before they ever reached the front lines. And while movies often depict arrows bouncing harmlessly off plate armor, reality was more complex. Armor offered protection, but it was not impervious. Joints, visor, slits, armpits, and even the soft underlayer beneath the armor were vulnerable. Arrows could penetrate chainmail or find gaps in plate, causing serious injury or death. Knights had to constantly move, adjust their formations, and use shields not just offensively but defensively, creating layers of protection while advancing. The psychological effect was as important as the physical threat. Hearing the whistling of arrows overhead, seeing comrades struck down, knowing a miscalculation could be fatal, it was constant pressure, and it shaped every tactical decision on the battlefield. Crossbows added a terrifying layer of complexity. Unlike longbows, crossbows required less physical strength to fire, allowing slower but often more accurate and heavier bolts to pierce even the best armor. A crossbow bolt could penetrate a knight's breastplate at close range, and these weapons were especially effective against formations or charging cavalry. Knights often faced volleys of bolts before even closing with the enemy, forcing them to rely on shields, terrain, and sheer speed to minimize casualties. Defensive formations became essential. Even the most experienced knight couldn't simply charge forward blindly. They had to coordinate with infantry, position their mounts carefully, and anticipate the trajectory of enemy fire. The battlefield was no longer just a contest of steel, it was a layered, multi-dimensional environment where survival depended on awareness and adaptability. Surviving missile fire was not just about armor and shields. Knights employed clever strategies, sometimes learned through trial, observation, or experience. Terrain became a weapon in itself. Hills, ditches, and natural obstacles could provide cover from archers or force enemies to aim uphill, reducing accuracy. Knights often waited for specific moments, gaps in enemy fire, signals from allies, or distractions caused by other units to advance safely. Movement was unpredictable. Linear charges were suicidal under heavy arrow fire. Instead, knights used staggered advances, zigzagging, and leveraging distractions to minimize exposure. In many ways, survival against missiles required as much strategic thinking as skill in melee combat. Each step forward was calculated, each pause measured, and every exposure weighed against the potential gain of closing distance with the enemy. The psychological impact of missile fire cannot be overstated. A volley of arrows striking near a knight's position was terrifying even if the armor absorbed most of the impact. The constant whistling and thudding of arrows into shields, armor, and the ground created confusion, fatigue, and panic. Horses, too, were affected. Despite training, destriers could spook at the sound of incoming missiles, rear, bolt, or stumble, threatening both themselves and their riders. Knights had to maintain control over these powerful, unpredictable animals while simultaneously defending themselves, striking when possible, and adjusting their movement to avoid incoming fire. The combination of physical strain, psychological pressure, and the need for rapid adaptation made missile defense one of the most complex aspects of medieval combat. Archers and crossbowmen were often deployed strategically to target vulnerable points in enemy formations. Cavalry charges could be disrupted entirely by well-timed volleys, with arrows piercing riders or horses, forcing knights to alter their approach. Even a single wounded horse could unseat a knight, or slow an entire unit, and injuries from arrows could incapacitate a fighter in seconds. Countermeasures included shields, but also coordination with other units' infantry, advancing alongside cavalry to create mobile cover, feigned movements to provoke premature volleys, or timing charges to coincide with distractions elsewhere on the battlefield. It was an intricate dance, blending timing, coordination, and the anticipation of enemy action in ways that most people never associate with the romanticized image of a knight charging heroically across an open field. The design of armor itself was heavily influenced by the need to survive missile attacks. Knights optimized coverage while maintaining mobility, paying attention to joints, gaps, and the layering of chainmail beneath plates. Helmets were designed with narrow slits for vision, and shields were positioned to protect the most exposed areas during approach. Even so, armor could not guarantee safety. Arrows and bolts often targeted gaps, and a well-placed shot could pierce at close range. This dynamic forced knights to combine protection with constant movement, tactical thinking, and anticipation of enemy behavior. Close coordination with mounted and infantry allies became crucial. Knights were rarely isolated in these circumstances. They relied on others to create cover, absorb fire, or distract enemies while they advanced or maneuvered. Missile attacks also influenced the pace and style of engagement. Knights often delayed their charges until archers had exhausted their supply or shifted attention. Cavalry might advance in staggered formations to reduce vulnerability, using terrain and timing to mitigate risk. Even once melee combat began, awareness of ranged threats remained. Archers were not eliminated instantly. They could continue to fire into disrupted lines or retreat strategically to maintain pressure. Knights needed to remain aware of these threats while focusing on immediate close-quarters survival, effectively juggling multiple layers of danger simultaneously. The battlefield was a constantly shifting chessboard where every move carried immediate and lethal consequences. Horses added an unpredictable variable in this context. While destriers were trained for battle, the chaos of arrow volleys, whistling bolts, and sudden movements often triggered fear. Spooked horses could trample allies, bolt into enemy lines prematurely, or stumble in ways that disrupted formations. Knights had to manage their mounts carefully, using reins, leg pressure, and subtle shifts in weight to maintain control under extreme stress. The combination of missile fire and chaotic ground conditions made this task almost as dangerous as engaging the enemy directly. Survival required a delicate balance between aggression and caution, between charging forward and retreating to avoid fatal exposure. Another layer of complexity was the strategic use of shields and secondary weapons. Knights often carried smaller shields, called pavises or bucklers, which could be raised to protect against missile fire, while leaving a hand free for sword, mace, or dagger. This dual functionality allowed them to maintain offensive capability while minimizing exposure. The placement of shields, timing of blocks, and integration with other maneuvers required continuous attention. Knights constantly monitored enemy positions, predicted arcs of incoming missiles, and adjusted their posture and movement to reduce vulnerability. Even the simplest action, raising a shield, stepping aside, or angling a horse, could spell the difference between life and death. Missile defense also highlighted the importance of teamwork and coordination. Knights rarely faced archers or crossbowmen alone. Infantry, supporting cavalry, and even other knights created layers of defense. Soldiers positioned themselves strategically to absorb or deflect incoming fire, while knights used movement and timing to minimize risk. Communication signals, horn blasts, or visual cues was essential to coordinate these actions effectively. Individual skill mattered, but survival against ranged threats was inseparable from group strategy. The battlefield became a complex web of interactions where each participant influenced the outcome, not only for themselves but for everyone around them. Despite the constant danger, knights continued to advance under missile fire, adapting their tactics and exploiting openings. A staggered charge, careful use of terrain, and coordinated movements could allow a unit to close the distance with minimal casualties. Once in close quarters, ranged threats became less effective, and knights could leverage their training, weapons, and momentum to dominate engagements. The process required precision, discipline, and relentless focus under stress. Mistakes could be fatal, but careful adaptation allowed even heavily targeted knights to survive and impose their presence on the enemy. Finally, consider the broader strategic implications. Missile fire was not just a battlefield hazard, it shaped entire campaigns. Commanders used archers and crossbowmen to weaken enemy forces before engagement, dictate the pace of battle, and create psychological pressure. Knights adapted, refining their formations, improving armor, and developing tactics to minimize vulnerability. The interaction between ranged and melee combat was a defining feature of medieval warfare, challenging the myth of the lone, unstoppable knight. In reality, success required constant calculation, coordination, and respect for the unseen threats that could end life as swiftly as the closest sword strike. In summary, surviving missile fire demanded more than armor or bravery. Knights faced arrows and bolts as constant, invisible threats, requiring tactical movement, teamwork, and continuous adaptation. Horses, terrain, and psychological pressure compounded the challenge. Shields, secondary weapons, and strategic timing became essential tools in countering ranged attacks. The battlefield was a multi-dimensional environment where observation, anticipation, and flexibility were just as important as the ability to swing a sword. Knights were not invincible heroes, they were trained, adaptive survivors, constantly negotiating threats, seen and unseen, working with allies, and exploiting every opportunity to minimize risk. Understanding this reality transforms the romanticized vision of medieval combat into something far more human, intense, and deadly. A world where survival depended on awareness, adaptability, and the constant interplay of skill, instinct, and calculation. When people imagine knights, they often picture open-field battles, thunderous charges, and the gleam of polished armor under a bright sun. What is rarely depicted is the gritty, relentless reality of siege warfare, where knights faced a different kind of battle, one that was slow, grueling, and psychologically punishing. Castles, walled towns, and fortified positions presented obstacles that a horse, lance, or sword could not simply overcome. Siege warfare demanded strategy, patience, and the willingness to confront dangers on multiple fronts. Arrows raining from battlements, boiling oil or sand poured from above, and massive machines hurling stones that could crush a horse or shatter armor. Knights, accustomed to mobility and offensive power, had to adapt to confined spaces. Coordinated assaults, and a battlefield dominated not by open plains, but by walls, towers, and fortifications. The first challenge for knights during a siege was the terrain itself. Unlike open-field battles, where momentum and speed were decisive, the approach to a fortress or city gate was controlled by the defenders. Moats, ditches, and earthworks slowed or redirected forces, creating choke points where numbers became less relevant and individual skill became critical. Knights could not simply charge headlong. Every step had to be calculated. Horses were trained for battle, but navigating steep inclines, muddy embankments, or narrow causeways under arrow fire was a daunting task. The enemy used these natural and man-made obstacles to their advantage, and a misjudgment could result in a knight falling, being impaled, or trampled by both friend and foe in the confined approach. The combination of restricted movement, exposure to ranged attacks, and unpredictable footing made the siege environment far more dangerous than the open battlefield for mounted warriors. Once knights reached the base of a wall or gate, the challenges intensified. Defenders had multiple ways to repel attackers, and crossbows from battlements, rocks and boiling liquids, even dropping spiked beams or logs. Each of these threats required constant awareness and rapid adaptation. Knights could no longer rely solely on their lances or swords. Shields became essential tools, not only to block arrows but also to push through narrow passages, protect against falling debris, and create openings for allies to advance. The tight quarters of a siege transformed the use of weapons, making reach, leverage, and coordination more important than raw striking power. A knight's skill in handling a poleaxe or sword became intertwined with his ability to read the environment and anticipate every threat coming from above or from the flanking sides. Siege weapons themselves presented a terrifying new dimension. Catapults, trebuchets, and mangonels hurled massive stones or incendiary devices over walls, capable of crushing horses and knights alike. The impact of a single projectile could unseat a rider, destroy armor, or create panic in tightly packed ranks. Knights advancing under these threats had to maintain focus, coordinate movements with infantry and engineers, and anticipate trajectories while keeping momentum. They often relied on scouts or sappers to identify weak points in walls, gates, or defensive structures. Knowledge of these points could make the difference between a successful assault and total annihilation. Unlike open combat, where the battlefield could be read in real time, sieges demanded long-term observation, patience, and careful timing, sometimes lasting days or even weeks, with constant vigilance against both physical and psychological exhaustion. Bringing siege ladders or scaling towers added another layer of complexity. Knights were trained for mobility, but ascending a ladder under attack required a different skill set altogether. Shields had to be maneuvered to block arrows or boiling substances, while weapons were used to defend both oneself and comrades. Climbing meant vulnerability, and coordination was essential. One slip could end in death, taking both horse and knight out of the fight. Attackers often had to work in teams, with some holding ladders steady, others providing covering fire, and yet others climbing while protecting their comrades with shields or weapons. It was a delicate choreography, and even experienced knights could fall victim to missteps, enemy countermeasures, or sudden structural failures. Siege warfare demanded not only strength and courage, but an almost surgical precision in the execution of tactics under extreme duress. The use of sapping, tunneling, and mining added an additional element of danger. Engineers and sappers would dig beneath walls to collapse gates or towers, but these operations were often exposed to counterattacks or sudden cave-ins. Knights supporting these operations had to guard workers, clear debris, and repel defenders in tight, confined spaces. The stakes were high. A single collapse could bury soldiers alive or cut off a critical pathway for assault. Coordination between knights, infantry, and engineers was crucial, and situational awareness became paramount. Unlike the cinematic notion of storming a castle with a thunderous charge, real siege operations were meticulous, exhausting, and demanded constant vigilance against unpredictable dangers that could strike without warning. Close combat during sieges was a nightmare of intensity. Narrow streets, gates, and stairwells confined knights and soldiers into tight presses where grappling, thrusting, and striking had to be executed with extreme precision. The confined environment magnified every mistake. Knights could not swing freely. The risk of striking an ally or losing balance was constant. Weapons like maces, axes, and short swords were often more effective than long, sweeping swords, allowing controlled, powerful strikes in tight quarters. Shields were indispensable, not only for personal protection, but for managing crowd pressure and creating breathing room to maneuver. Survival depended on a combination of brute strength, technical skill, and the ability to anticipate the movements of both enemies and allies within a rapidly shifting, chaotic environment. Psychological pressure was another defining aspect of sieges. The prolonged exposure to danger, combined with fatigue, hunger, and the constant threat of projectiles, created intense mental strain. Knights were accustomed to open battle, where the chaos is punctuated by bursts of action and periods of observation. In a siege, the danger was continuous. Every moment required attention, yet fatigue and stress could dull reflexes, slow decision-making, and reduce coordination. Horses, too, experienced stress. Spooked animals could stumble, refuse to advance, or trample both allies and enemies, compounding the danger for knights, who relied on their mounts not just for mobility but for combat effectiveness. Siege warfare tested endurance in ways that open battles rarely did. requiring both physical stamina and mental resilience in equal measure. Coordination between units was absolutely critical. Knights rarely acted alone during a siege. Infantry, engineers, archers, and supporting cavalry all had to work in harmony. A misstep by one unit could expose the entire assault force to deadly counterattacks. Siege towers, ladders, and sappers required protection while moving into position, and timing had to be precise. Communication was essential, often relying on visual signals, horn blasts, or pre-arranged signals to coordinate movements across the battlefield. Knights had to adapt rapidly to changing conditions and arrow volley. A collapsed wall or a sudden surge of defenders could force immediate tactical shifts. Success required not only individual skill, but the ability to read and respond to a constantly evolving, multi-layered environment. Defensive tactics forced knights to adapt their offensive strategies continuously. Moats could require bridging or filling, gates could be reinforced or barred, and defenders could deploy sudden countermeasures like boiling substances, spiked beams, or rolling stones. Knights had to anticipate these obstacles and work with engineers and infantry to neutralize them. Flexibility, improvisation, and the willingness to experiment under pressure were essential. Unlike cinematic depictions, where a single charge breaches walls effortlessly, real siege warfare demanded repeated adjustments, careful observation, and the coordination of multiple efforts over hours, days, or even weeks. The margin for error was almost non-existent, and the consequences of failure were immediate and severe. Once breaches were made, knights often faced the most intense close combat of the entire engagement. Entering through walls or gates meant stepping into confined spaces densely packed with defenders. Grappling, stabbing, and strikes were executed in rapid succession, often with multiple attackers and defenders entangled together. The chaos amplified every threat. Falling debris, panicked soldiers, and projectiles compounded the danger. Knights had to maintain situational awareness, control their own movements, and anticipate the reactions of enemies in ways that combined tactical intelligence, reflexes, and endurance. The environment forced improvisation. What worked in open combat often had to be modified, adapted, or abandoned entirely. Victory depended on a combination of preparation, training, adaptability, and sheer courage under relentless pressure. Even the psychological dimension of conquering a fortress was immense. The prolonged exposure to constant threat, the pressure of leading or coordinating units, and the responsibility for both personal survival and the lives of comrades created a relentless stress load. Knights had to balance aggression with caution, risk with strategy, and movement with protection. Every decision was amplified in consequence. Hesitation could be fatal, while reckless action could endanger allies or compromise the assault. Siege warfare was as much a test of mental fortitude as physical capability, demanding endurance, focus, and the ability to remain effective under sustained adversity. Finally, the aftermath of a siege illustrated the full toll on knights and their forces. Walls broken or gates captured did not signify immediate safety. The battlefield within the fortifications was often chaotic, filled with traps, collapsed structures, and injured or desperate defenders. Knights emerged physically battered, mentally drained, and frequently wounded, despite armor and training. Weapons bore marks of intense use, shields were dented or broken, and horses often suffered from exhaustion, injury, or panic. Even a successful siege left a lingering awareness of the fragility of life, the constant proximity of death, and the necessity of adaptation in every subsequent engagement. Survival was never guaranteed, and every knight carried both the scars and the lessons of the siege into future battles. In conclusion, knights in siege warfare faced a reality far removed from the open-field charges of popular imagination. The combination of physical obstacles, ranged attacks, confined spaces, psychological pressure, and the need for constant adaptation created a uniquely grueling form of combat. Success required coordination with allies, rapid decision-making, technical skill, and mental resilience. Weapons, armor, and horses were essential tools, but survival depended equally on awareness, improvisation, and the ability to navigate a constantly shifting, lethal environment. Siege warfare revealed the true complexity of medieval combat, a world where strategic insight, adaptability, and endurance were as critical as courage, and where knights were tested to their absolute limits in every dimension of battle. When we imagine knights in battle, The common mental image is often solitary glory, a mounted warrior surging forward, lance leveled, cutting through enemies with heroic precision. Yet the reality of large-scale medieval battles could not have been further from that romantic vision. Knights were not isolated champions. They were part of a complex web of human effort, where their survival and effectiveness depended on coordination with infantry, other knights, and the ever-unpredictable movements of the battlefield itself. Understanding this interplay reveals a truth often hidden beneath the glittering myth. Medieval warfare was a relentless, chaotic orchestration of bodies, weapons, and strategy, where skill, timing, and intuition were as vital as courage or strength. From the moment a battle began, knights were immersed in what might best be described as controlled chaos. The battlefield was a dynamic and ever-changing environment, filled with infantry formations, cavalry charges, archers raining arrows, and irregular forces moving unpredictably. Lines would form and collapse in seconds, creating pressure points that demanded immediate response. Knights could not operate in isolation. Every decision where to advance, whom to target, when to strike, when to retreat had consequences for both themselves and the larger formation. They were part of a living organism, with each unit, weapon, and individual influencing the outcome in real time. The large-scale battlefield was an ecosystem of threats and opportunities, and mastery required both observation and the ability to act decisively in the midst of relentless motion. Infantry played a critical role in this environment. Contrary to cinematic portrayals, foot soldiers were not merely cannon fodder for knights to cleave through. They were strategic tools, capable of holding lines, creating barriers, and controlling space. Shield walls, spear formations, and coordinated thrusts could stop a cavalry charge in its tracks, or create openings for knights to exploit. A single misalignment in an infantry line could spell disaster for a mounted charge, sending horses and riders into a deadly tangle of bodies. Knights had to read these formations, timing their movements to exploit weak points while avoiding concentrated opposition. Coordination with infantry was as vital as the knight's own combat skills, and those who failed to account for the flow of foot soldiers often found themselves isolated and vulnerable amidst the melee. Large-scale engagements also demanded acute situational awareness. Unlike small skirmishes or duels, where threats were relatively contained, massive battles presented multiple simultaneous dangers. Archers and crossbowmen could target exposed units, cavalry could flank unexpectedly, and enemy formations could shift to exploit weaknesses. Knights had to interpret these signals instantly, adjusting position, pace, and focus to maintain cohesion with allies while minimizing exposure. Horses added another layer of complexity. A spooked destrier could trample infantry, break formation, or stumble into enemy lines, creating a cascade of unintended consequences. Knights had to manage not only their own actions, but also anticipate the movements of mounted and foot allies, turning instinct and experience into a finely tuned survival system in the midst of unpredictable chaos. The role of discipline and training cannot be overstated. Knights did not operate purely on brute strength. They were schooled in tactics, formations, and coordination from the outset of their military careers. Understanding the timing of charges, the angles of attack, and the flow of reinforcements allowed knights to integrate their power with that of infantry units. Cavalry often depended on infantry to anchor flanks, secure vulnerable points, and create controlled avenues of approach. Conversely, infantry depended on knights to break through resistance and create openings. This interdependence created a complex rhythm in battle, where every individual action resonated through the formation, sometimes amplifying force and sometimes precipitating collapse. Those who could read and anticipate these dynamics thrived. Those who could not became casualties. Large-scale battles also amplified the unpredictability of individual human behavior. Panic, fatigue, and confusion spread rapidly. Soldiers might break formation, flee from perceived threats, or inadvertently block allies' movements. Knights had to adapt continuously, responding to both enemy and friendly actions that could be as dangerous as direct attacks. Grappling with these variables demanded more than skill with weapons. It required rapid assessment of evolving conditions, creative problem-solving under stress, and a deep understanding of both human and animal behavior. Survival became a continuous negotiation, balancing aggression with caution, initiative with coordination, and timing with opportunity. One aspect often overlooked is the psychological warfare inherent in large-scale battles. Knights were both participants and instruments of fear. The presence of mounted cavalry charging in disciplined formation could disrupt enemy morale before physical contact was made. Infantry formations, shouting war cries, or brandishing weapons in unison created an intimidating impression of cohesion and strength. Simultaneously, knights had to manage their own stress and fear, maintaining focus amid the tumult of screaming, clashing metal, and chaos. Fatigue, confusion, and uncertainty tested even the most experienced warriors, and mental resilience often determined the difference between survival and fatal mistakes. Large-scale battle was as much a test of endurance and psychological fortitude as it was a contest of skill and strength. Communication and signals were crucial to maintaining cohesion. In the absence of modern tools, knights and commanders relied on visual cues, banners, horn blasts, and pre-arranged maneuvers to synchronize movements across the battlefield. These signals had to be interpreted under stress and chaos, often while under fire or in the midst of melee. Miscommunication could lead to catastrophic errors, such as isolated charges, friendly collisions, or the exposure of flanks. Knights needed to constantly scan the battlefield, anticipate enemy and ally movements, and adjust their actions to maintain alignment with strategic objectives. Coordination was not optional. It was essential for survival and effectiveness in the maelstrom of battle. The integration of weapons and armor also played a critical role in large-scale engagements. Knights were equipped not only to strike, but to survive in the press of men, horses, and obstacles. Shields were essential for both offense and defense, blocking attacks from multiple directions while creating space to maneuver. Weapons were chosen for versatility: swords for close strikes, lances for initial charges, maces and axes for breaking formations or dealing with armored opponents. Effective use required rapid adaptation to context. A weapon effective in an open charge might be useless in a crowded melee. Conversely, a short, powerful strike could decisively end a skirmish in close quarters. Knights constantly calibrated their equipment, movement, and tactics to maintain both lethality and survival. Cavalry tactics also illustrate the complexity of large-scale coordination. Charges had to be timed precisely to avoid collision with allies or premature engagement with enemies. Flanking maneuvers required communication and synchronization with infantry movements to prevent exposure of vulnerable lines. Knights often formed multiple layers within formations, with frontline riders absorbing initial contact and secondary units exploiting openings created by breaches or collapses in enemy lines. Horses were trained to respond to nuanced commands, anticipating shifts in terrain or enemy position, but human skill remained critical. Effective cavalry required both individual excellence and seamless integration with the broader unit, demanding awareness, judgment, and continuous adaptation under stress. Large-scale battles were also theaters of improvisation. Despite extensive training, knights frequently encountered unexpected scenarios, terrain anomalies, weather changes, enemy feints, or accidental obstructions. Rapid adaptation was crucial. Knights might need to dismount and fight on foot, redirect charges, or improvise formations in response to sudden shifts. These adjustments could determine the outcome of engagements, highlighting the interplay between training, instinct, and quick thinking. Even the best-laid plans were vulnerable to chance, and the knight's ability to react dynamically often shaped a difference between success and catastrophe. Physical endurance was as critical as skill. The exertion of mounted combat, repeated charges, grappling in close quarters, and maneuvering under pressure was immense. Armor added weight, restricting movement and increasing fatigue, while the chaotic environment demanded constant attention and physical effort. Knights, who could maintain strength and focus throughout prolonged engagements, were invaluable, while exhaustion could lead to fatal mistakes. Large-scale battles were a test of stamina, resilience, and the ability to maintain tactical effectiveness despite cumulative stress, injury, and confusion. Survival demanded a fusion of mental, physical, and strategic endurance, far beyond what is often portrayed in romanticized depictions. The interplay between knights, infantry, and irregular forces created complex dynamics that shaped outcomes. Infantry often anchored positions, absorbed enemy attacks, and created openings for mounted units, Irregular forces, scouts, and archers influenced the flow of battle through harassment, flanking, or ranged pressure. Knights were integral components within this network, capable of decisive breakthroughs, but dependent on timing, coordination, and the reliability of allies. Understanding and managing these interactions was as vital as individual combat skill, illustrating the intricate choreography and layered strategy inherent in large-scale medieval warfare. Finally, the aftermath of large-scale battles revealed the consequences of coordination, or the lack thereof. Units could be scattered, horses and riders injured or killed, and formations irrevocably broken. Survival often depended not on heroics but on discipline, situational awareness, and the ability to maintain cohesion amid chaos. The battlefield was a constantly shifting arena, where every movement resonated through the formation, and where the consequences of a single misstep could ripple outward, endangering entire units. Knights emerged not just as warriors but as orchestrators of coordinated chaos, whose effectiveness depended as much on observation, adaptation, and strategic integration as on raw combat skill. In conclusion, knights in large-scale engagements were far more than individual combatants. They were nodes in a complex network of human effort, reliant on coordination with infantry, cavalry, and support units, and constantly negotiating the unpredictable dynamics of battlefield chaos. Skill with weapons and armor remained essential, but survival and effectiveness depended equally on observation, adaptability, endurance, and psychological resilience. Large-scale battles were living, shifting systems of threats, opportunities, and interactions, and the knight's role was to navigate this system with precision, foresight, and unwavering focus. Understanding this reality transforms the romanticized image of isolated heroism into something far richer, a nuanced portrait of human ingenuity, coordination, and endurance in the face of overwhelming chaos. When we think of knights, it is tempting to imagine them gliding across sunlit fields, their polished armor gleaming, swords cutting a clear path through orderly ranks of enemies. Reality, however, was far more unpredictable, far more brutal, and often far less romantic. Knights did not only contend with human opponents, they were constantly negotiating a battlefield shaped by terrain, weather, and natural hazards. The ground itself could betray them, mud could swallow horses' hooves, rain could obscure vision and weigh down armor, and storms could turn even the most carefully planned maneuvers into chaos. Mastery over these environmental factors was as crucial as mastery of weapons, and survival often depended on understanding, adapting to, and sometimes exploiting the natural elements in ways that were as creative as they were desperate. The first and most obvious factor was terrain. Knights were trained to charge across open fields, but medieval battles rarely took place on perfectly flat, obstacle-free ground. Hills, ridges, rivers, forests, and ditches shaped the movement of forces and created tactical advantages or deadly traps. A slight incline could sap the energy of horses before reaching the enemy, while uneven ground could unbalance both rider and mount, exposing them to attacks. Forested terrain limited visibility and mobility, making coordinated charges nearly impossible and forcing knights into small-scale, chaotic skirmishes. Rivers, streams, and marshes could halt entire units, and even a deceptively shallow bog could trap horses and soldiers, leaving them vulnerable to arrows, crossbows, or hand-to-hand assault. Knights needed to read the land constantly, calculating the risks of each step, adjusting formations, and sometimes abandoning preferred tactics to survive the unpredictability of the natural battlefield. Weather compounded these challenges, adding another layer of complexity and danger. Rain turned fields into mud, slowing horses, dulling edges of weapons, and creating treacherous footing for foot soldiers. Armor, already heavy, became waterlogged and exhausting, turning a charge that might have relied on speed and momentum into a slog of fatigue and strain. Storms could obscure vision, hide enemy movements, or create sudden, violent conditions that rendered ranged attacks more or less effective. Snow and ice added yet another hazard, making slopes slippery, rivers partially frozen and unstable, and horses prone to falling. Heat could sap energy, causing dehydration or heat stroke, while cold could stiffen muscles, impair reaction time, and increase the risk of injury. Knights were conditioned to endure discomfort, but the battlefield amplified every physical strain. An environmental misjudgment could be as lethal as any opponent's sword. Even the smallest details of terrain and weather could have cascading effects on tactics. A muddy slope could delay a cavalry charge, allowing archers to pepper a formation with arrows before engagement. A narrow forest path might force knights to dismount and fight on foot, turning what should have been a rapid advance into a slow, exhausting melee. Rain or fog could hide enemy positions, create miscommunication among units, or lead to accidental collisions that disrupted formations. Every step required attention, every choice carried consequences, and adaptability became as critical as strength. Knights often relied on scouts, engineers, or infantry guides to interpret the terrain, anticipate hazards, and recommend safer approaches. Understanding the land became a form of tactical intelligence, integrated into the larger strategy of the battle. Horses were particularly sensitive to terrain and weather, creating a constant variable for knights to manage. Destriers were powerful, trained mounts, but they could stumble on mud, refuse to enter water, slip on ice, or panic in unexpected conditions. A spooked horse could throw a rider into enemy hands, trample allies, or disrupt a carefully planned charge. Knights had to maintain constant control through reins, leg pressure, and subtle shifts in balance, while simultaneously engaging in combat and reacting to threats. The coordination between knight and horse was an ongoing negotiation with both the animal's instincts and the environment, a dance that required awareness, patience, and rapid adaptation. Success in this domain could magnify a unit's effectiveness, while failure could lead to immediate chaos and casualties. Natural obstacles also shaped the approach to fortified positions. Hills could conceal enemy archers or ballistae, while forests could hide flanking forces. Rivers and moats created choke points that slowed knights and funneled them into concentrated zones of danger. Even seemingly minor features, like uneven ground or small ridges, could be leveraged by defenders to maximize the effect of ranged attacks or to destabilize charging units. Knights needed to constantly assess these variables, adjust formations, and maintain communication with allied units. They were not only warriors but field analysts, reading subtle cues from the landscape to predict enemy actions and avoid hidden threats. Adaptation to these factors was not optional, it was a matter of survival. Weather could also alter the effectiveness of weapons and armor. Swords could become slippery, reducing grip and control. Axes and maces could become unwieldy when wet or dulled. Armor could rust or absorb water, increasing weight and fatigue. Horses' hooves and shoeing could be compromised by mud or ice, reducing traction and increasing the likelihood of falls. Even ranged weapons, like bows and crossbows, were affected. Wet strings could lose tension, arrows might not fly straight, and bolts could become dangerously unpredictable. Knights had to compensate for these variations, adjusting techniques, modifying equipment, and sometimes relying more heavily on brute strength or positional advantage than on finesse. Environmental awareness became a form of tactical literacy, and failure to understand it could be fatal. Psychological effects of terrain and weather were equally profound. Continuous exposure to harsh conditions, combined with fatigue, injury, and the constant threat of enemy attack, created intense mental strain. Knights had to maintain composure and focus, managing fear, uncertainty, and the ever-present risk of accidents caused by the environment. Horses could be spooked, formations could break, and sudden weather changes could force rapid tactical revisions. Maintaining morale, both personally and among allies, required experience, discipline, and leadership. Knights who faltered under these pressures could imperil not only themselves but entire units, making mental resilience as crucial as physical endurance. The interplay between terrain, weather, and tactical decision-making was complex. Knights learned to exploit environmental conditions to their advantage. A rain-soaked field could slow infantry and make a cavalry charge more devastating. Fog or darkness could conceal maneuvers or allow surprise attacks. Hills and ridges could provide cover from ranged weapons or reveal enemy positions before engagement. Observing patterns in wind, sunlight, and ground conditions allowed knights to anticipate enemy strategies, position units advantageously, and make tactical choices that increased survival and effectiveness. The natural world became both a tool and a threat, shaping decisions and outcomes in ways that went far beyond simple heroics. Coordination with infantry and supporting units was essential in navigating terrain and weather. Foot soldiers could clear paths, hold unstable positions, or provide cover from ranged attacks. Engineers and scouts interpreted environmental hazards and recommended alternative approaches. Knights were often at the center of these coordinated efforts, relying on the movement, timing, and communication of allied forces to mitigate the risks of the environment. Success required continuous situational assessment, flexible planning, and the ability to adapt instantly to unexpected challenges. Even the most skilled individual could be rendered ineffective without effective integration into the larger operational framework. Terrain and weather also influenced strategy over entire campaigns. Commanders had to consider river crossings, forested approaches, mountain passes, and seasonal conditions when planning engagements. Knights, as mobile and powerful units, were critical in exploiting advantages, securing objectives, or protecting vulnerable flanks. Yet they remained constrained by the realities of the land and weather, demonstrating the profound impact of natural conditions on medieval warfare. Even a perfectly trained knight could not overcome deep mud, torrential rain, or sudden snowstorms without careful planning and tactical adaptation. Understanding these limits was part of the strategic literacy essential to both individual survival and battlefield success. Even in smaller skirmishes, the natural environment dictated tactics. A narrow bridge could serve as a deadly choke point. A forested ravine could conceal ambushes. A hilltop could provide dominance over an enemy approach. Knights had to integrate this environmental intelligence with observation of enemy forces, timing, and coordination with allies. Every maneuver became a negotiation between human skill, mounted capability, and environmental realities. The complexity of this negotiation often dictated the pace, form, and outcome of engagements, highlighting the intertwined influence of natural and human factors on medieval warfare. Knights also had to contend with unexpected environmental hazards. Flash floods, sudden storms, or structural failures could disrupt even the most disciplined formations. Horses might stumble in hidden ditches, bridges could collapse, or ground could give way beneath a formation, creating cascading failures that were exploited by opportunistic enemies. Adaptation, rapid decision-making, and physical skill became paramount in these situations. Knights relied on instinct honed by experience, constantly scanning the environment, anticipating hazards, and positioning themselves in their units to mitigate risk. Survival was as much about understanding and reacting to nature as it was about striking down enemies. The psychological dimension of environmental hazards was equally significant. Knights were trained to endure discomfort and stress, but continuous exposure to mud, rain, heat, cold, or uneven terrain intensified fatigue and anxiety. Horses mirrored these stresses, adding unpredictability to combat. Fatigue, fear, and environmental difficulty could erode discipline, causing mistakes that reverberated through the formation. Knights had to maintain composure, manage resources, and make tactical choices under conditions that could be as threatening as enemy swords. Their effectiveness depended on resilience, situational awareness, and the ability to integrate environmental intelligence with the execution of combat techniques. Finally, the aftermath of engagements shaped by terrain and weather highlighted the toll on knights. Horses and riders often emerged exhausted, injured, or stressed. Armor and weapons bore the marks of environmental wear and combat use. The lessons learned from navigating natural hazards informed future campaigns, influencing the choice of approach, routes, timing, and formation strategies. Knights carried not only physical scars but accumulated knowledge about the interaction between battlefield conditions and human performance, knowledge that could make the difference between life and death in future engagements. In this way, the environment was both teacher and adversary, shaping tactics, behavior, and survival in ways that went far beyond the immediate clash of weapons. In conclusion, knights were not only warriors but environmental strategists, constantly negotiating terrain, weather, and natural hazards as integral components of medieval combat. Success depended on observation, adaptation, endurance, and coordination with allies. The battlefield was a living, dynamic system where the interplay of land, weather, and human action dictated tactics, outcomes, and survival. Knights' ability to read, react, and exploit these factors transformed them from mere combatants into skilled navigators of chaos, combining physical prowess with tactical intelligence in the relentless challenge of medieval warfare. Understanding this dimension of combat reveals the true complexity of knightly skill. a nuanced, multi-dimensional mastery of both human and natural forces that shaped every engagement, every charge, and every battle. The life of a knight was often imagined as a sequence of glorious battles, heroic charges, and decisive victories. Yet the reality was far more grueling, far more exhausting, and far less glamorous. Warfare was not confined to the moments of combat. It extended across entire campaigns that tested physical endurance, mental resilience, and the ability to manage both human and equine resources under harsh conditions. Marching for miles, maintaining equipment, preserving strength, and tending to injuries were as much a part of a knight's life as the clash of swords or the thunder of hooves. Prolonged campaigns revealed a side of knighthood rarely depicted in popular imagination, a relentless negotiation with fatigue, wounds, supply lines, and the unpredictable consequences of exhaustion on both mind and body. Campaigns began with logistical challenges that could define the effectiveness of a unit long before battle commenced. Horses, for example, were as essential as weapons, and their health dictated the pace and capabilities of mounted knights. A destrier could carry its rider into battle with formidable force, but it also required food, water, rest, and careful attention to prevent injury. Fatigue could reduce a horse's speed, responsiveness, and stamina, increasing the risk of collapse in combat. Knights, often responsible for the care of their mounts, had to remain vigilant, inspecting hooves, adjusting tack, and monitoring behavior for signs of distress. Neglect could render even the most heavily armored and skilled warrior ineffective before reaching the battlefield, highlighting the symbiotic relationship between rider and steed, where survival depended on careful management as much as combat skill. Humans, too, suffered under the strain of prolonged campaigns. Long marches, harsh weather, inadequate nutrition, and sleep deprivation combined to erode strength, coordination, and mental acuity. Knights in full armor faced amplified fatigue. The weight of plate and chainmail, combined with the need for constant attention to weapons and horses, created physical strain that could accumulate over days of travel. Even minor injuries, cuts, or bruises could become serious liabilities when compounded by exhaustion and environmental stress. Pain, reduced reaction time, and muscle fatigue created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by an alert enemy. Survival demanded a careful balance between exertion and conservation, an ongoing calculation of energy, attention, and timing in the context of both the campaign and the imminent threat of battle. Nutrition and hydration were critical, yet often unpredictable. Campaigns relied on supply lines, local foraging, or requisitioned resources, none of which could guarantee sufficient sustenance. A knight's energy levels, reaction speed, and endurance were directly tied to food and water, making logistical awareness as vital as tactical planning. Malnutrition or dehydration reduced the effectiveness of both human and equine participants, compounding the hazards of exhaustion. Knights had to ration resources, anticipate delays, and sometimes make difficult choices between advancing with a weakened force or pausing to restore strength, all while remaining vulnerable to enemy action. The mundane realities of sustenance thus became a critical factor in the outcome of campaigns and battles alike. Injuries presented another constant challenge. Unlike cinematic portrayals, wounds were rarely minor or conveniently healed between engagements. Even seemingly superficial cuts could become infected, and chronic pain could impair movement, stamina, and morale. Knights faced the dual reality of continuing to fight while managing injuries, and the psychological toll of knowing that a single misstep could exacerbate a wound was ever present. Armor could protect against some hazards, but not against fatigue-related mistakes, environmental dangers, or concentrated attacks. The combination of physical injury, exhaustion, and ongoing combat created a cumulative risk that could turn a skilled warrior into a liability, emphasizing the brutal reality that survival in warfare required constant vigilance, careful self-management, and adaptability. Campaigns often stretched over weeks or months, with knights engaged in intermittent skirmishes, patrols, and reconnaissance in addition to full-scale battles. Each movement required navigation of terrain, management of horses, and coordination with infantry, engineers, and support units. The cumulative effects of travel, exposure, and limited rest amplified fatigue and stress. Sleep was often limited, disrupted by weather, terrain, or enemy action, reducing both cognitive and physical performance. Knights needed to maintain alertness despite exhaustion, anticipate threats, and make strategic decisions under conditions of severe strain. Survival became a continuous negotiation between immediate tactical demands and the long-term management of energy, health, and resources. Resource management extended beyond nutrition and rest to include weapons, armor, and equipment. Prolonged campaigns subjected gear to wear, damage, and environmental degradation. Weapons dulled or broke, armor became dented, and horseshoes wore down or were lost. Knights needed to carry out repairs in the field or rely on support units to maintain operational readiness. Failure to manage equipment effectively could compromise both offensive and defensive capability, creating vulnerabilities that were rapidly exploited by enemy forces. The interplay between human endurance, equipment reliability, and battlefield performance formed a complex web of dependencies, each element critical to survival and effectiveness. The unpredictability of environmental conditions further amplified the challenge. Rain, mud, snow, and extreme temperatures compounded fatigue and increased the risk of injury. Horses could stumble or spook, while knights' mobility and reaction times were impaired. Terrain could conceal hazards, alter movement, and disrupt formations. The interaction between fatigue, injury, and environmental stress created a cumulative effect, requiring constant adaptation and strategic awareness. Knights were not merely combatants, they were managers of variables, balancing physical, psychological, and logistical factors in a dynamic, high-risk environment. In addition to physical challenges, prolonged campaigns imposed psychological strain, constant exposure to danger, uncertainty about supply, and the stress of leadership responsibilities created persistent mental pressure. Knights had to maintain focus, composure, and decision-making ability under conditions that would test the strongest individuals. Fatigue, fear, and frustration could impair judgment, leading to tactical errors or accidents. The capacity to endure stress, manage emotions, and remain operationally effective was as essential as strength, skill, or courage. Knights were tested not only in combat, but in the unrelenting demands of campaign life, where mental resilience often determined survival as much as martial prowess. Injury and exhaustion also influenced tactical decisions. Knights had to weigh risk against capability, sometimes refraining from offensive action to conserve energy or protect vulnerable comrades. They had to assess the condition of horses, the readiness of equipment, and the alignment of allied forces before engaging. The need for constant situational assessment under fatigue added a cognitive dimension to the physical challenges of warfare. Campaigns became exercises in resource allocation, risk management, and endurance. With failure potentially fatal to both the individual and the unit, survival was a product of judgment, adaptability, and disciplined management of both self and environment. The coordination between knights and supporting units became crucial under these conditions. Infantry, engineers, and logistical personnel provided essential support, from carrying supplies to maintaining equipment, guarding positions, and assisting with injured mounts or soldiers. Effective integration with these units was often decisive. Knights could not act in isolation. Their combat effectiveness depended on the reliability, coordination, and responsiveness of supporting forces. Misalignment or failure in any component could compromise a larger strategy, illustrating the interdependent nature of campaign survival and battlefield success. Knights were central actors within a broader network of interrelated human and material factors. Whether terrain, exhaustion, and injury also dictated the pacing of campaigns. Rapid movement might offer strategic advantage, but risked overtaxing horses and riders, while slow progress reduced exposure but allowed enemies to fortify positions or execute ambushes. Knights had to balance these considerations continuously, adjusting pace, formation, and engagement strategy in response to dynamic conditions. Decisions were compounded by uncertainty. Hidden hazards, enemy action, and unpredictable terrain required flexibility and readiness to adapt. Strategic and tactical awareness were inseparable from the management of physical and psychological resources, reinforcing the notion that survival was as much a product of planning and endurance as of combat skill. The interplay of fatigue, injury, and environmental conditions often determined the effectiveness of knights more than individual heroics. A skilled combatant could be rendered ineffective if mounted on a fatigued horse, suffering from dehydration, or navigating treacherous terrain. Success depended on an integrated approach. monitoring physical condition, managing resources, coordinating with allies, and adapting to constantly evolving circumstances. Campaigns were not measured solely by the number of battles won, but by the ability to maintain operational capacity over time, making endurance, flexibility, and tactical intelligence the cornerstones of survival and effectiveness. Injuries, both minor and severe, required ongoing management. Cuts, bruises, sprains, and fractures were common, and even a small wound could become debilitating if infection or strain compounded the problem. Knights had to balance the need for rest and recovery against the demands of campaign movement, supply constraints, and imminent engagements. Decisions about whether to continue, delegate responsibilities, or modify tactics had direct consequences for both individual survival and unit cohesion. The ability to judge risk, prioritize recovery, and integrate these considerations into operational planning was a crucial skill, often differentiating successful knights from those who succumbed to the cumulative effects of strain. The cumulative effects of exhaustion, injury, and environmental challenge extended into the conduct of battle itself. Knights arriving fatigued, dehydrated, or riding exhausted horses faced increased risk of errors, slower reaction times, and reduced combat effectiveness. These factors could amplify the lethality of even small mistakes and influence the outcome of engagements. Coordination with allies became more critical, as support units could compensate for fatigue, shield vulnerabilities, or reinforce weakened positions. The integration of human, equine, and material resources under extreme stress defined the practical limits of knightly capability, revealing a layer of complexity absent from romanticized portrayals of battlefield heroism. Finally, the psychological toll of prolonged campaigns, compounded by exhaustion, injury, and environmental hazards, left an enduring impact. Knights carried not only physical scars, but heightened awareness of their own limitations, the unpredictability of forces beyond their control, and the necessity of discipline, endurance, and adaptability. Survival was a continuous negotiation between human capacity and the harsh realities of campaign life, where success depended on the integration of tactical skill, physical resilience, resource management, and psychological fortitude. Knights were not solitary heroes. They were adaptive, strategic, and resilient participants in a system defined as much by endurance and planning as by martial prowess. In conclusion, prolonged campaigns revealed the multidimensional challenges faced by knights beyond the battlefield. Fatigue, injury, environmental stress, and resource management shaped effectiveness and survival, emphasizing endurance, coordination, and adaptability over isolated heroics. Knights functioned within complex, interdependent systems, balancing physical exertion, psychological resilience, and tactical decision-making under sustained pressure. Understanding these realities transforms the myth of effortless, chivalric glory into a nuanced portrait of disciplined, adaptive warriors, navigating a relentless series of physical and mental challenges, where survival was determined as much by planning, endurance, and awareness as by combat skill. Campaign life demanded an unrelenting balance between strength, strategy, and adaptability, revealing the human realities behind the polished myths of knightly legend. The life of a knight, when stripped of romanticized imagery, was an unrelenting continuum of danger, exertion, and uncertainty, where each battle, campaign, and maneuver carried consequences that stretched far beyond the immediate clash of weapons. By the time a campaign reached its final stages, the true measure of a knight's skill was no longer simply in the ability to wield sword, lance, or mace with precision. It was in the capacity to endure, adapt, and survive under relentless pressure. The battlefield was an unforgiving teacher, imparting lessons through exhaustion, injury, and loss, and the cumulative toll of campaigns revealed a reality far removed from cinematic heroism. Survival depended as much on judgment, resilience, and strategy as it did on strength or courage. At the culmination of any engagement, the battlefield presented a grim tableau, one that offered little opportunity for reflection before the consequences of action or inaction were felt. Horses, having borne their riders through mud, rain, and combat, were exhausted, injured, or sometimes lost entirely, collapsing under the strain of repeated charges or falling victim to enemy strikes. Knights themselves bore the physical marks of battle: deep cuts, bruises, fatigue-soaked muscles, and the persistent ache of injuries sustained in the heat of chaotic skirmishes. Even a minor wound could be debilitating when combined with exhaustion, cold or hunger, reducing reaction time and mobility. Each step taken, whether to press forward or retreat, was a calculated risk, demanding continuous attention to personal and unit safety in the midst of style-unfolding threats. Survival in these moments relied on acute situational awareness. Knights had to interpret the battlefield in real time, assessing the positions of allies, the movements of enemies, and the changing contours of terrain that could conceal hazards or provide opportunity. Horses, though trained and disciplined, were living variables, reacting unpredictably to noise, movement, or stress. A sudden stumble, panic, or injury could cascade into chaos, disrupting formations, creating vulnerabilities, or injuring those nearby. Knights needed to anticipate these dynamics, adjusting movement, signaling allies, and balancing aggression with caution. Every decision carried amplified consequences, where a single misjudgment could undo hours, days, or weeks of strategic planning and effort. The aftermath of battle brought additional challenges, often overlooked in stories of glory and triumph. Wounded soldiers required immediate attention, yet the chaotic environment left little opportunity for organized medical care. Infection, untreated fractures, or internal injuries posed lethal risks, and the need to secure resources for both human and equine survivors became urgent. Knights, despite their central role in combat, were not exempt from these responsibilities. They were often called upon to assist in moving injured comrades, reorganizing units, or securing the battlefield to prevent further losses. The physical and mental demands of these tasks compounded exhaustion, testing endurance, leadership, and adaptability long after the last sword had fallen or the final arrow had been loosed. Psychological consequences of prolonged engagement were profound. Witnessing the injuries, deaths, and disarray of comrades and enemies alike created a persistent awareness of mortality, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of war. Knights had to process the loss of allies, the randomness of survival, and the knowledge that the next engagement could be equally or more lethal. Maintaining morale, composure, and operational effectiveness under these conditions required immense psychological resilience. Fatigue, grief, and stress could impair judgment, reduce reaction time, and amplify risk, making mental fortitude as critical to survival as physical skill or equipment. Knights were, in many ways, trained not only to fight, but to endure the unrelenting human realities of combat, adapting continuously to the pressures of war. The consequences of battle extended beyond the immediate battlefield to the broader campaign. Units needed to regroup, recover, and plan for subsequent engagements, often under the continued threat of enemy pursuit or ambush. Horses required rest, feed, and medical attention. Armor and weapons required repair. Injured soldiers needed care or evacuation. Knights were central to this process, coordinating with infantry, engineers, and logistical units to restore operational capacity. Strategic awareness extended beyond tactics to encompass resource management, timing, and the physical and psychological readiness of both men and mounts. A failure in any component could compromise future effectiveness, highlighting the complex interdependence of forces and the continuous challenges of campaign life. Adaptation was a constant requirement. Even the most skilled knights could not rely solely on past experience, training, or conventional tactics. Each engagement brought new variables, unexpected terrain, weather shifts, enemy maneuvers, and internal fatigue. Decisions had to be made under pressure, balancing immediate tactical opportunity with the long-term necessity of preserving resources and maintaining operational readiness. Improvisation, creativity, and rapid assessment of unfolding conditions were as critical as weapon mastery, and often separated those who survived from those who did not. Knights functioned as both warriors and problem solvers, navigating a chaotic environment with foresight, skill, and an unrelenting attention to both human and natural factors. Even the tools of combat required constant attention. Weapons dulled, broke, or became unwieldy. Armor became dented, waterlogged, or compromised. Horses suffered from injury or exhaustion. Maintenance and repair were ongoing necessities, and knights frequently performed these tasks themselves or supervised support units. The effectiveness of a knight depended not only on the moment of combat, but on the careful management of equipment and resources over time. The narrative of heroic, uninterrupted action fails to capture this reality. Survival and effectiveness were cumulative, shaped by continuous attention to detail, foresight, and the integration of multiple interdependent elements. The physical toll of sustained campaigns cannot be overstated. Knights experienced muscle strain, joint fatigue, dehydration, and the cumulative effects of repeated stress on the body. Sleep was often limited, disrupted by weather, terrain, or security concerns. Nutrition was irregular, leaving soldiers vulnerable to weakness and reduced endurance. Each day of a campaign was a test of stamina, resilience, and resourcefulness. Knights who could maintain operational capability under these conditions were rare. Many were reduced in effectiveness before they ever reached the decisive moments of battle. The romantic image of the invincible mounted warrior conceals the reality of human limitation under prolonged stress. In addition to physical and psychological strain, knights faced moral and ethical complexities rarely acknowledged in popular imagery. Decisions made under duress, whether to engage, retreat, or prioritize resources carried consequences not only for themselves but for comrades, civilians, and captured enemies. Survival often required rapid judgment under imperfect information, balancing personal risk, unit cohesion, and strategic objectives. Mistakes could lead to unnecessary deaths, strategic setbacks, or cascading failures within formations. Knights operated in a morally ambiguous and highly dangerous environment, where heroism was inseparable from responsibility, judgment, and the relentless calculus of risk versus reward. The reality of post-battle survival also extended to the social and economic dimensions of knighthood. Wounded or fatigued, knights needed access to care, replenishment of supplies, and sometimes financial resources to maintain equipment and horses. Campaigns imposed financial and logistical pressures on both individuals and feudal systems. Knights were embedded within networks of obligation and support, where survival depended on a combination of personal skill, strategic planning, and the reliability of allies, vassals, and supply chains. Warfare was thus a multidimensional endeavor, extending beyond the battlefield to encompass health, logistics, and social networks. Long-term consequences of sustained campaigns included physical disability, chronic injury, and psychological trauma. Knights carried these burdens forward, affecting their effectiveness in subsequent engagements, their ability to command or coordinate units, and their overall quality of life. Survival did not guarantee continued combat readiness, and even experienced warriors could be rendered ineffective by cumulative wear and tear. The reality of knighthood was thus inseparable from endurance, adaptation, and the careful management of personal and unit resources over time. Glory was fleeting. Survival required constant vigilance, discipline, and strategic awareness. Even in moments of victory, the cost was evident. Horses were exhausted or lost, weapons and armor were damaged, and soldiers were wounded or dead. Victory did not erase fatigue or injury. It merely shifted the challenges to the next phase of the campaign. Knights needed to reorganize, secure supplies, care for the wounded, and prepare for future threats. The battlefield remained a living, evolving environment, demanding continuous attention and adaptation. Success depended not only on martial skill but on strategic, logistical, and psychological mastery over a complex and unforgiving reality. Finally, the cumulative experience of campaigns, battles, and survival shaped the identity of knights. They emerged as warriors honed not only in skill but in endurance, judgment, and adaptability. The realities of fatigue, injury, resource management, and coordination with allies instilled a deep understanding of both human and environmental factors in combat. Survival became a metric of skill as much as courage, reflecting the integration of physical, mental, and strategic faculties. Knights were not invincible heroes. They were adaptive, resilient participants in a system that demanded constant vigilance, coordination, and intelligence. In conclusion, the culmination of a knight's experience in battle and campaign life reveals a truth far removed from popular imagination. Survival depended on the integration of skill, endurance, judgment, coordination, and adaptability, influenced by physical, psychological, environmental, and logistical factors. Knights were embedded in complex networks of interdependent human and material resources, negotiating chaos, uncertainty, and danger continuously. The reality of knighthood was an unrelenting exercise in observation, adaptation, and resilience. where the capacity to survive and maintain effectiveness defined the ultimate measure of a warrior. Understanding these dimensions transforms the myth of heroic, effortless glory into a nuanced portrait of human perseverance, skill and strategic intelligence, offering a far deeper appreciation for the realities of medieval combat and the enduring legacy of those who endured its relentless trials. So, after 15 segments of wandering through muddy battlefields, chaotic charges, relentless campaigns, and the unpredictable grip of nature, we finally arrive at the truth of knighthood. It was never about effortless heroism or cinematic glory. Knights were not invincible champions who strode across fields of enemies with perfect precision. They were human, tired, battered, adaptable, and, above all, resilient. Their victories were as much about endurance, careful planning, and coordination with comrades as they were about swordsmanship or lance technique. Every charge, every maneuver, every swing of a weapon carried consequences, and survival depended on reading the battlefield, managing resources, and sometimes sheer persistence in the face of chaos. The reality of medieval combat is far messier than we often imagine. The horses faltered, the mud slowed them down, arrows rained from above, and even the most disciplined formations could collapse in seconds. Yet, through all of this, knights endured. They adapted to the terrain, mastered coordination with infantry and cavalry, managed exhaustion and injuries, and made countless split-second decisions that could mean life or death. They were warriors of skill, endurance, and intelligence, not simply of bravery. Understanding their reality, how they truly wielded weapons, survived campaigns, and navigated both human and natural challenges, gives us a glimpse into the intricate complexity of medieval warfare, far beyond the myths and movie depictions. As we close this chapter of history, imagine the twilight settling over a battlefield, the dust beginning to rise, and the distant echoes of hooves fading into memory. Knights, both living and fallen, have left traces of their endurance, their struggles, and their humanity. They remind us that behind every tale of valor lies layers of effort, hardship, and survival that are often invisible at first glance. And as we turn our attention away from these fields of mud, steel, and blood, we can carry with us an appreciation for the quiet resilience that defined their world, a resilience not always visible, but always essential. So, as you drift off tonight, let the stories of these warriors linger in your mind, not as tales of perfect heroics, but as a window into the human spirit under extreme pressure. Imagine the quiet after battle, the long march home, the worn armor, and the tired horses resting under the moonlight. Let it remind you that history is not just about what happened, but about those who endured it, day after day, charge after charge. Good night, traveler of time. Rest now and dream of the past, where courage, endurance, and the human will shaped every clash of sword and every beat of hooves across the fields of history. Tomorrow, the world may feel different, but tonight, let the night's story linger gently as you drift to sleep.